Good morning and welcome back to CNAS's annual National Security Conference. I'm Richard Fontaine, the Chief Executive Officer of CNAS. Our first panel today is Protecting Democracy, Protecting National Security. It'll be moderated by Axios National Political Correspondent and Jonathan Swan, and it'll feature Congresswoman Elissa Slotkin, Congressman Peter Meijer, and CNAS Senior Fellow Carrie Cordero. We'll start that in just a minute. Following the session, we'll have one on military recruitment for an era of competition, and then Russia, an assumptions check, America and the Middle East, and the Quad equation, how four democracies can uphold the rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific. For those of you who'd like to engage with the panelists, ask questions, make comments during the sessions, you can follow us on Twitter at CNASDC, tweet using the hashtag CNAS 2021. You can also join the conversation and submit questions by visiting the official conference website, conference.cnas.org or cnas.org/live. So with that, let's kick it off. And I will now turn it over to Jonathan Swan, who will moderate our opening panel. So thanks, Jonathan, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Richard. And thanks to everyone for tuning in. This session is going to be focused on Homeland Security oversight and the intersection of national security and bolstering US democracy. We've got a fabulous panel. Democratic Congresswoman Elissa Slotkin. She represents Michigan's 8th Congressional District. She's a former CIA officer, served multiple tours in Iraq, and she held senior defense and intelligence positions during the Bush and Obama administrations. We've also got Republican Congressman Peter Meijer. He represents Michigan's 3rd Congressional District. He's an Iraq veteran who went on to serve veterans and lead an NGO in Afghanistan that provided emergency assistance to aid workers after kidnappings and targeted killings. And of course, we have Carrie Cordero, and she's one of the country's most respected counterterrorism and counterintelligence experts. She has deep experience in government. She held senior national security roles at the Justice Department and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. And she's now a senior fellow and general counsel at CNAS. And I'm Jonathan Swan. I'm just a reporter. So I want to start by acknowledging an ugly reality, which is that domestic terrorism and political violence have penetrated the halls of Congress. Representative Liz Cheney says, and I interviewed her recently, she says that Republican members have confided in her that they would have voted to impeach Donald Trump after January 6th, but they decided not to out of fears for their personal safety. Congressman Meijer, as a Republican, you took that tough vote to impeach former President Trump. You've admitted publicly that this was probably political suicide, but have you worried, actually, I don't know a more delicate way to put this, that it's not just political danger that you find yourself in?
I mean, there's certainly a personal kind of risk element. I think the way I framed it was, I don't believe in the heckler's veto, and I also don't believe in the assassin's veto. I think you mentioned the fear around that vote. I had colleagues who expressed deep concern around just the vote to certify the election and whether that would put themselves or their families at risk. And to me, that is a clear danger sign of kind of where we are right now. If we have politicians who are making decisions and basing their votes, not necessarily based on their judgment, but based on real and tangible concerns. And that, again, that was before we were heading into this. That was before what we saw, the violence of the Capitol on the 6th.
I mean, to the extent that you're comfortable talking about it, I mean, how has your life in that respect changed since you took that vote?
A lot more looking over your shoulder. I mean, again, I have to frame it in the context of having spent 3 years between Iraq and Afghanistan, and in Iraq as a combatant, where I had a weapon and I could call up air support, and had that armored vehicles and all sorts of defensive abilities. Afghanistan, where I was a civilian, unarmed, living on the economy. So very, very different kind of night and day scenarios there. But I would say when it comes to now being in politics in Washington, having to be very aware. I mean, we saw the violence, the attack on the Republican members who were practicing for the congressional baseball team back in 2017. We saw the shooting of Gabrielle Giffords back in, I believe, 2010 or 2011. So, I mean, the violence has been there, but just obviously where we are today with kind of countering notions of reality, one, that the election was stolen and that the 6th was the day to stop that steal, and the other where it wasn't, and January 6th was a ministerial act of Congress to certify an election. And if you believe that the election was stolen and that this was an assault on our democratic systems that of an unprecedented scale, then what logically is justified based on that belief can lead to some pretty dark and scary terrain.
Congresswoman Slotkin, the Republican Party, I should stress, not Congressman Meijer, but the majority of the party has blocked the commission to investigate January 6th. Do you see any way to conduct a credible bipartisan investigation into what happened?
Well, I think that's what we're trying to parse through right now. It was a really disheartening moment to watch it fail in the Senate, particularly for those of us who's been in national security, and so much of our career has been shaped by the 9/11 Commission and then the WMD Commission, right? These are things that are sort of the luminaries of our time have put these together. And the 1/6 Commission was literally a cut and paste job from the 9/11 Commission. You can look at the mandate and it was a cut and paste. So we're trying to parse our way through it. I think it's important that we remember who the audience is. The audience for this, in my goal, is not inside the Beltway kind of members of Congress. It's the American public who all watch those events unfold on TV. Just like the 9/11 Commission turned into a paperback book that you could buy at any newsstand, they made graphic novels out of it, and the textbooks that our kids now read about 9/11 are based on that report. That's what I'm interested in. So it's important, if you're thinking about the audience, that it be bipartisan, even though that's hard. We have to figure out a way for this to not become a political clown show, and actually give it some sense of credibility, not inside the Beltway, but for the American people. And it's difficult.
Well, respectfully, it already is a political clown show. The question is how, at this point, now Republicans have blocked this commission, and you just described the framework. What happens now?
Yeah. So we did have a bipartisan group of senators who actually put out a pretty good report, literally just about the security side of what happened just this past week, which I thought was a good start. One of the options, frankly, both Representative Meijer and I are on the Homeland Security Committee. There is discussion of handing it over to our committee, since no one would get to name new committee members and wouldn't turn into maybe a political clown show even more maybe than it could be at this point. There are options to create, again, a bipartisan group, a special select committee, but there are all lesser options, that's for sure.
Right.
But
your committee's pretty good, though. I mean, in terms of bipartisanship, the Homeland Security Committee's quite good, isn't it, in the context of Congress?
Yeah, and it was our chairman and ranking member who drew up the provisions for the bill on the 1/6 Commission. So they're serious people, but there's a range of voices on our committee, as Peter knows. And I think that's good. That's the point, right? Is to not just stack the deck with people will give a good speech on camera, but actually put people in there who are representing the public and asking those tough questions.
Carrie, you and I have talked about this a little bit over the months. You're really worried about the rise of political violence in America. What in your mind needs to be done to address it?
So thanks, Jonathan, and thanks to both of the members for joining us for this conversation. So Jonathan, I'm really worried about the fact that there are members, and I really do believe that there are, whose actually votes, whether it was on impeachment, whether it was on the January 6th Commission, or as Congressman Meijer says, whether it was on the actual vote to certify the election, whether their votes are being affected because they fear for their own safety, or they fear for the safety of their families. And the reason that is such a bad place for the country to be is that they are then impacted, or in some cases perhaps prevented from doing their constitutional duty. And so we really are at a place where if this isn't just one member, if this is multiple members who have credible fear, it is impacting the functioning of the country, the ability of the Constitution to actually work in a functional way. So there are some things that I think can be done about it, both in the short term and the longer term. Representative Slotkin mentioned the most recent Senate report that came out. So just this week, the Senate Homeland Committee and the Rules Committee issued a staff report that focused on some of the security issues related to January 6th. And General Honore had also done a very quick review that came out in March regarding some issues regarding the Capitol Police. I think the work that was done in those two reports, at least, can inform more work that needs to be done to improve the security of members. I know that Congress doesn't like to spend money on itself, but it really needs to take the security, the leadership needs to take the security of members really seriously and do more for the physical security of members, not just at the Capitol, but General Honore's report discussed how there is very spotty and inconsistent and ad hoc security provided for members when they are traveling and when they are at home in their districts. There's a lot of recommendations that are out there to improve the functioning of the Capitol Police. The Capitol Police at this point cannot just, be about monitoring visitors coming in. There is a really serious job that we see that they need to do, and the functioning of their board in particular. And I don't think that this issue has gotten enough import in either of the two reports that have come out so far. But a board cannot be operational. So they currently have a board that governs the Capitol Police, and that hampered some of the operational speed and efficiency leading up to and on January 6th. And so the functioning of that board and really making sure that the commander of the Capitol Police has operational control and on-scene command for a day that is important to the Capitol complex needs to be fixed. And then the third piece that I'll mention, Jonathan, is in the longer term. So those are some short-term things that I think need to be done to really take seriously the security and safety of members of Congress. In the longer term, the other way that I think the leadership has a responsibility is to have more accountability for members who are involved in inciting or encouraging, or even themselves being aggressive towards other members of Congress, because that their followers, their constituents, they see that behavior and those speeches. And so I think there does need to be a more of an accountability within the Congress itself for having some decorum, having civil discourse, and not accepting members of Congress, creating an environment that makes their colleagues unsafe.
I want to pull back a little bit. Both members of Congress on this Zoom come from Michigan. It's a state with a long and pretty sordid history of local militias, and it's become a bit of a poster for domestic extremism. Last year, law enforcement disrupted a right-wing extremist plot to kidnap your governor. Representative Slotkin, should we view Michigan as an aberration, or is it a sign of where things are heading, a bit of a canary in the coal mine? How do you see it?
Well, I do think that at least in the past year, Michigan has been kind of a harbinger of what's to come on the national scene. And, we had armed protesters force their way into our Capitol in April of 2020, a good 9 months before they came inside the Capitol. On the 6th of January, we have had a rise in militia groups. The raid that you're talking about that disrupted the plot against our governor was in my district. It has definitely been grappling with this, and we have somewhat of a history with it as well. I think that the important thing, though, is two things. One, this rise in all these things came from the normalization of hate. the normalization of threatening violence against political opponents. That was normalized over the past 4 years. So it's become commonplace. I mean, literally yesterday, they sentenced a man, to 2 years parole for threatening me in my office over and over again, and finally arrested him when he was brandishing his AR-15. Like, it's become sort of commonplace, but that doesn't mean it has to stay commonplace. And I think deterring people and showing people that we will act within the legal framework is extremely important for the next year. People need to see that I might lose my job. I might lose my, status in the community if I'm caught threatening violence. That has to be a red line in a diverse country. So I do think Michigan, we had our share of this, but we also, it just doesn't represent the average person in our state. The average person in our state does not talk like that, does not act like that. We're a swing state. We always have been. So it gives me hope that as we start to deter and set a red line on threatening violence, that we'll see some of that, calm down a bit.
Thank you. Congressman May, you and Congresswoman Slotkin are allies in trying to solve this problem across the aisle. You're both on the Homeland Security Committee, and you've both had the experience in Michigan, sort of ground zero of some of this stuff. What are some of the practical, specific things that you can do in your committee work to address domestic extremism, both at the federal level and in your own communities?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the important things is making sure we don't forget the word violent, because the extremist label gets thrown around. Where it trips from and where those First Amendment protections run out is when somebody engages in or prepares to engage in an act of violence. I have a lot of people will come up and say, you're targeting me, you're stigmatizing me, you're calling me a terrorist. And I'm like, when we say violent, are you planning to engage in violent activities? Are you preparing to take up arms against the government? Is that what you're trying to do? Or they go, no. I'm like, then you don't have any, I'm not talking about you. I mean, one of the challenges in our rhetorical environment is everything gets painted with such a broad brush that it, on the right, we use socialism so much as a cudgel going back years than when a policy is legitimately socialist or someone claiming themselves, that's lost all value. On the left, white supremacy has taken on that same valence, where we talk in such broad brush terms that we lose the ability to specifically say what we're doing. And I think to Elissa's point, talking on these issues of making sure we're being very clear on the violence, making sure that we are protecting constitutional rights and we are respecting the difference between somebody who is airing a constitutionally protected opinion versus those who are planning or conspiring to engage in violent activity is essential. But a lot of this really has to get down at the local level as well. And this is something that we saw with the rise of Islamic extremism as well. How can nothing happens in a vacuum. Nothing happens in isolation. You look at the reports of a lot of the individuals who were arrested for attacking law enforcement at the Capitol. This did not come out of nowhere. There were signs of individuals who were making themselves more prone to being radicalized, who were going down dangerous paths. So how do we have in the community the ability to try to get people back together? I mean, that was, I think, one of the reasons why we saw both the eruption of violence over the summer and the attack on the Capitol. The social isolation and alienation and pressure of a pandemic society has had that impact, right? People start to go crazy when they're removed from other people. And those neighbors, those family members, the people who go to church with you, I mean, those are going to be that first line of trying to get someone back. That local law enforcement can hopefully identify and talk with and sit down and have an honest conversation with somebody before they get to the point of wanting to take up arms and engage in a violent act. So the more we can begin to localize some of these issues is critical, while at the same time, and this is where Elissa and I have been talking with federal authorities, where are current statutes inadequate and how can we modify them in a way that still respects constitutional rights? Because dealing with violent extremism at home, there may be some parallels to international extremism, but there are still very concrete night and day differences that we need to never forget.
Well, you just raised a whole bunch of really interesting and complicated issues in what you just said. I want to pick out a few of them. So the first is the question of violence. So, okay, everyone understands when someone starts ranting, I'm going to shoot up a school, that's a moment for intervention. But as you acknowledged later in your answer, there's a ladder, there's an escalatory ladder. It might start with someone going down a wormhole on YouTube, watching Jewish conspiracy videos, and then they start watching more, unsavory content, getting more and more radicalized, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's a question about intervention. And I wonder, firstly, for you, Congressman Meijer, there's obviously, you raised the issue of civil liberties and constitutional rights, and there are really real things to balance there. But, if I'm a impressionable young man and I'm on YouTube and I've watched my fifth, the Jews are terrible, evil people, or whatever bigoted Muslim video, my fifth one in a row, should I have some kind of, should there be an intervention on the sixth video? How do we, what is the intervention there for, is there a government role? Is it a social media company role? Or is this just, going down a path that you don't approve of?
I mean, my vast preference is for that, your neighbor is going to have your family member is going to have a much better idea. Are you watching those?
They might not know. They might have no idea. You might be doing incognito or whatever.
Let me frame it this way. That person close to you, and as somebody who has been pulled into the little back room at JFK flying back from Afghanistan because it showed I had a one-way ticket, I had very good reasons to be there as somebody who was working and had business cards and all this, but, lumped in that same. I do not trust necessarily our federal apparatus to be able to distinguish between the grad student writing a dissertation topic on anti-Semitism who's watching those videos, and a kid who's got, a swastika painted on the wall and is, obsessed with atom waffen division, right? We need to be making sure that we are doing so in a way that is being thoughtful above all else. And on that point, I mean, this is where leaders have a responsibility, and I'm getting a little bit away from the question, but leaders have a responsibility to be setting that overall framework, right? To not be creating the permission structure that kind of winks and nods and rides right up to a line. It maybe doesn't cross it, so they can say they didn't cross it, but the people on the other side of that line look at it not approvingly and feel like they have a fellow traveler, right? I mean, that is where the leadership responsibility should be at a community level. And we've seen this in some, especially in the Arab community in Michigan. It's been incredibly helpful to have trusting relationships with law enforcement, that it's not that you don't have to wait until something goes so far that it's beyond salvation, right? That it's beyond redemption. At the same time, that tip or that alert doesn't result in the cuffs immediately coming on and somebody getting removed from the community when it hasn't gone that far. There's a very fine balance that I think in dealing with Islamic extremism, our federal government has gone, in that post 9/11 era, what the cuffs came on very quickly, and there were some demonstrable abuses. In later iterations, there were better information sharing from the local level on up, and this is where a lot of our conversations have been focused. Oftentimes, that isolated incident where somebody may get arrested for something and it's suspicious, but it's not crazy. There may be another breadcrumb that the federal government is aware of not being connected. I think that connective tissue is important, but also having local input to be able to offer those atmospherics and those characterizations so that it's not a black or white distinction, but something where we recognize we're in a gray area.
But here's the problem with what you're saying, and I want to get Congresswoman Slotkin's views on this, is yes, absolutely. There's a role for civil society, a very important role in community leaders, et cetera. And you raised the example of the post 9/11 environment where law enforcement, yes, there were abuses, but they also in some instances worked very effectively with Muslim leaders to, if someone's going down the wrong path, to intervene early. Congresswoman Slotkin, when we're talking about right-wing white supremacists, you don't just call up the local chapter of the Ku Klux Klan. I mean, who do you deal with? I mean, it's a really serious question. When you don't, it's not like these people are going to church necessarily or actually engage. It's an atomized society. They're in these disgusting little rabbit holes with really foul people. And how do you actually penetrate that? If you get a call, Congresswoman Slotkin, from a mother in your district saying, I'm at my wit's end, my son is anti-Semitic or he's Islamophobic, he's ranting about this, he's not saying anything violent. Who do I call? Who do they call?
Yeah. So there are actually, they're a very small scale, but there are organizations around the country who do this, who basically do, I don't know what to call it, deprogramming of people who are off on the wrong track. And what I think the Department of Homeland Security has already announced is that they're going to put in $40 million to sort of supercharging these organizations, expanding them, helping other nonprofits who do look at communities where you have a disproportionate problem on this issue. And it's not perfect. Anyone who was working in the post 9/11 era will tell you we never really, this is a very complicated problem and we were not perfect at it, right? At all.
Right.
But you got to try where you have, so there are nonprofit organizations that do this and they're about to get significantly more funding. And I will say, I'm the chairwoman of the Intel and Counterterrorism Committee, the committee that Peter's on and that we focusing on domestic terrorism. And we are trying to learn the lessons of the post 9/11 era, both good and bad, when we look at whether we're right-sized on domestic terrorism, right? We responded emotionally to 9/11, and God knows I did. I was in New York City on 9/11, like we had been attacked. But when you think about what we did to respond, some of it was great. And if you would have asked me 20 years ago, are we going to go 20 years without another large-scale foreign terrorism attack on our soil? I would not have put money on this many years without one. But we also supported rendition, detention, Gitmo, torture, right? Waterboarding. In our emotion in response, we, I think, lost sight of our values for a while. And the goal is not to do the same thing with domestic terrorism. It's to be very clear-eyed about how we approach this problem. And while we do, the head of the FBI has said we lost more people in the United States in 2019 to domestic terrorism than to foreign terrorism, which is an amazing statement for someone to say, given the investment we make as a government in foreign terrorism. That doesn't mean that the pendulum should swing so hardcore that we decide this is the boogeyman, that we must change our laws, our intelligence community structure. We have to be thoughtful about how we do it and learn those lessons. But, there are some organizations to call when that mom calls you in the dead of night saying, my son is going off the wrong path. They're just too few and far between.
What do we need to do about intelligence collection on the domestic side? I mean, obviously, we after 9/11, we turned the full force of the US government onto this issue of radical Islamist terrorism. Do we do a similar approach domestically now, turning all these tools that we've developed over the last 20 years on our own citizens? I'd love to get each of your views on that.
Well, I'll just start as the former CIA officer. I will just say we're looking at this in our committee. I mean, this is a part of our work is trying to understand how to right size and make sure one hand is talking to the other. But it is eminently more complicated when it is our fellow Americans who are the ones we're talking about. There are laws that are just different, but also, I mean, as a CIA officer, we were trained, I mean, it was drilled into us that we do not collect on American citizens. There's literally generations of intelligence officers who just give you the Heisman the minute you even start talking about that. So we have to be super careful that the agencies that are tasked with looking at this anyways, right, that have it in their mandate, the FBI, Department of Homeland Security, maybe in a supporting role, the National Counterterrorism Center. Obviously, the DNI's office has to help us think through this, but I do not support DIA and CIA and everybody else just jumping in to look at our fellow Americans. And again, we have a very different legal structure when it comes to looking at domestic terrorism. If you have a guy sitting in my district who's flirting with Al-Qaeda in Syria or ISIS in Syria, the minute that guy buys a plane ticket and shows that he's demonstrating support for this organization, I can, get him on a charge of material support to terrorism. You have no such charge on the domestic side. So, and I think that's okay. I think that's all right because it is about our fellow Americans. So, I think we have to tread very carefully and make sure the agencies that have a domestic mandate are the ones reorganized and well-resourced to take care of intelligence collection on this issue.
Congressman Meijer, I see you're nodding along. You basically agree with what the Congresswoman just said?
Yeah, I mean, I think thinking that this is an intelligence collection problem is really missing the underlying issue. And I'd actually love to get Elissa's thoughts on something on just how many parallels there are with the radicalization path or the susceptibility to conspiracy theories that, again, in and of themselves are not dangerous, but what they permit to allow in the world, how they reorient someone's conceptions of what is good and what is bad, and who is an enemy and who is an ally is incredibly dangerous. I would love to get Elissa's thoughts on how, looking at a lot of the folks arrested at the Capitol. I mean, there were individuals who had kind of multiple bankruptcies, many of whom were upper middle class, but it had experienced financial hardships, and those who had gone through substance abuse and had those issues as well. How there are these markers where if somebody like that had a security clearance, that would start to get flagged and say, you could be recruited by a foreign government because there are vulnerabilities that they could exploit, right? A lot of the for-profit or for political power individuals who are exploiting them. And I was just talking to an individual last night who alternated between telling stories about, my grandfather who she knew, and saying that Trump was coming back and everyone who stabbed him and betrayed him would be hauled before a military tribunal and tried for treason. And then she ... Well, they get whatever the punishment is. I was like, it seems to me a lot like you're suggesting I'm going to be hauled before a military tribunal and shot. And she was like, no, well, like just how somebody gets to that point and what is permitted and allowed within that framework is incredibly dangerous. Much the same way that an individual being recruited by a foreign intelligence service is gotten to a point where betraying their country, betraying some underlying values becomes the logical framework, right? So just treating this, because by and large, I think that there is a risk from organized groups, right? And we saw this on the 6th with Oath Keepers and the 3%ers. We've seen this before with the Hootery and some others. Those groups are out there, but I think the magnitude of the challenge, it's more who the next Nashville bomber is, that is convinced of a 5G conspiracy, and that's why they're blowing up an AT&T communication site, right? Well, what happens when the enemy isn't just a network, but the enemy is a group of individuals, and that person, there may be warning signs, but even on the intelligence side, even the best of our intelligence capabilities is not well equipped to deal with that lone wolf, to deal with that atomized individual. And not only do we risk constitutional protections, but we also are not adequately addressing the problem if we think that's the solution. But I guess
did you want to react to that, Congresswoman?
Sure. I mean, I think that there's a strikingly similar pattern for people both abroad and at home who climb that ladder of escalation. I think it's strikingly similar. You have people of all economic backgrounds, but who are looking for community, who are looking for, they've got some sense of grievance. They've got something. I mean, even if from the outside, you don't think they deserve to have a sense of grievance, they feel a sense of grievance, and they start finding, fellow travelers online. They start climbing the ladder. And then they start threatening online. Then they start threatening in person. Then they start, with a sort of desecration or graffiti, and it is really striking how someone moves up that ladder. Extremely difficult to interrupt that ladder, just having knowledge of it, but then also being able to convince them. But I think what we do see is that when people have opportunities, when they have their grievances addressed, then they often don't feel like they're going to risk life and limb and their job and their family and their home to do something. That's not everybody. There are people who attacked us on January 6th who had every advantage in the world, right? Who had every economic stability, all the economic stability they could wish. But there are people, and we saw this in the Michigan plot to attack our governor, who are looking for community, and they have a sense of anger and grievance, and they're going to act on it. There's not great history of interrupting that cycle, but it is important that we recognize it is a cycle. So this is why one of those things that's most important and is so small is like reporting this stuff, right? Just reporting, like if a swastika is painted on your sidewalk outside your house, report it. If you've got someone at work who is agitating and threatening another colleague, report it. And most people I know in Michigan are like, I didn't want to make trouble. It was a relatively small thing. No, the FBI will tell you, we can't put together patterns. We can't address this issue if people don't report. And the vast majority of the stuff, people think it's below threshold, when in fact, you're in the middle of someone's ladder. You're catching them in like their ladder where they're starting to spray swastikas outside of businesses and churches, liberal churches, which is going on in my district. And it's like, you got to get to that person who's doing that before they go to the next level.
Have you done that yourself?
Climb which part?
No, intervened, like in the ladder.
So absolutely. I mean, we had a problem in my district about.
To be clear, I'm not accusing you of being on the ladder too.
Have I climbed the ladder of escalation? Not this week.
Let me rephrase. Have you?
I'm just checking. You're a hard-hitting journalist, Jonathan.
So, yeah. I'm not quite there, Congresswoman. Have you successfully because it is one of the hardest things to do. To successfully intervene in that ladder. Do you have a sort of story that you can share from your own life?
Well, I'll take two quick ones. One that was literally resolved yesterday, where a man kept calling and threatening myself and Senator Stabenow over and over again. 90-minute phone call after January 6th, threatening my poor 19-year-old intern, talking about wanting us dead. I mean, having an AR-15, talking about his weapons. 90 minutes. Luckily, I've now trained my interns and they recorded the entire thing. And the next week, he was caught brandishing his AR-15 at a local gas station about how the election was stolen, right? So because we kept talking about it and reporting it and I kept banging pots and pans, then the law enforcement moved with purpose, and he pleaded guilty, and now he has 2 years parole and removal of his weapons, right? It's not perfect, but and it shouldn't have to be a U.S. Congresswoman. The one that I see that we dealt with in January and February was constant Zoom bombing of church services and community city council meetings in one of my counties.
And just for the audience, what is Zoom bombing?
So it's when you're holding a church service and suddenly 15 people you don't know start getting on your Zoom. You can't see their faces. In this case, they all had pictures of people, either the KKK or giving the Nazi salute. And they start attacking via chat the pastor saying, I'm going to rape and kill you for teaching about Black History Month at church. And of course, what do? You shut down the Zoom, right? We had this for some of our city meetings in our local communities. It just kept happening. And I had to go to those communities and say, please report, please talk about this. I'm seeing these 4 different data points. You just don't know you're part of a trend. Please let law enforcement help and report this. Those have, for the large part, stopped, but it's just an indication of like how this stuff has seeped into the meat of our lives, how it's filtering down. And the swastika things outside cafes and churches in my district, you got to report that stuff.
We've got about 4 minutes left, and I just want to give 2 of those minutes over to Carrie just to broaden this out a little bit, because we've had to change the way we think about domestic extremism, but also a broader array of threats handled by the Department of Homeland Security. We've got to think about it in a profoundly different way than we did in the post 9/11 threat of jihadists. Carrie, I know you've thought a lot about this. Like, in what are the most urgent ways in which the Homeland Security apparatus needs to change and evolve to deal with this broader and quite different array of threats than we saw in 2002?
Sure. So I think there's 2 different pieces going on. So one is addressing the types of issues that we've been describing in this conversation, which what Representative Slotkin is really describing is the disruption piece. And that is the bread and butter of what the FBI does and their domestic terrorism capacity. They have the investigative lead to be able to identify those instances and then identify the potential criminal violations and disrupt that individual, take that individual off the street or those individuals before they do the bad thing. And there's a lot of parallels from the international terrorism of the last 20 years or so, and how that can be applied onto the domestic side, as long as it's prioritized and as long as it is resourced, and then obviously taking into account appropriate training to make sure that people understand when something is moving into the domestic terrorism side. On the DHS side, on the Department of Homeland Security side of things, I think we really are at the point where we need to be taking a really big picture look at what is the DHS of the future. On one hand, it has this huge law enforcement capacity that has built up over time. I'm not necessarily convinced that we need a DHS that looks like the Department of Justice with its heavy law enforcement and criminal investigative activities. Instead, a DHS of the future should be focusing on the things that it does best. What's something that it does really well? Well, it does national special security events well, protecting, taking into account all of its security capacities to prevent events. In my view, had January 6th been designated a national security special event with Secret Service as the lead, what happened would not have happened.
That's right.
The Senate staff report that came out this week discussed, on one hand, it said, yes, there could have been more intelligence reporting coming from the federal government, from DHS and the FBI. On the other hand, if you really read the whole report, there was a lot of intelligence information that was out there. There was intelligence that was put up by FBI Norfolk. There was intelligence that was in the hands of the Capitol Police. In my view, what happened on January 6th is that nobody in a position of leadership operationalized that intelligence. And so as we're thinking about all of the issues that we've just been discussing for the last 40 minutes, focusing on it only as an intelligence issue is kind of missing the bigger picture. What happened in my view is that there was a failure of people in positions of responsibility to understand that a political movement has become, in part, a violent political movement. And so we have to understand that that is a big part of what we're seeing here.
Well, I really appreciate all of your contributions. I mean, this was just a fabulous panel. For the audience, you're really not going to get three better contributors to a discussion like this, with the combination of authority to actually deal with these problems, personal experience, work with their constituents, and of course, Carrie's sort of big picture, long, vast experience on these issues. So, I've learned a lot doing this panel, and I hope everyone else did. So I want to thank you all for tuning in. And please stay on with Kate Kuzminski for the next session, which is called Military Recruitment for an Era of Competition. Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Kate Kuzminski, Director of the Military Veterans and Society Program at CNAS. Thank you for joining us for today's virtual panel. We encourage you to participate in a few ways as the panel goes on. First, we'll be asking a series of audience questions raised in the poll below. Second, we encourage you to submit questions as we go through the question box. And lastly, you can join our larger conversation by joining us on Twitter through the hashtag CNAS2021. The Military Veterans and Society Program at CNAS provides research intended to strengthen the all-volunteer force, support the veteran and military family community, and inform the civil-military dialogue. Our military personnel research focuses on how DoD and the services can recruit, retain, and manage the talent needed to fight and win the nation's future conflicts. There are a few things in the Pentagon more consequential than military personnel policy. The military personnel system is a closed promotion system, meaning that the future leadership for each of the services will be selected from the individuals that the services recruit today. Full military career paths range from 20 to nearly 40 years of service for flag and general officers, meaning that the talent pool from which the future Joint Chiefs of Staff will be selected in the year 2058 is being recruited today. While many in the defense community focus on the development of new platforms, weapon systems, or current operations, it's good to remember that it is service members in uniform who are the driving force for executing the nation's national security strategy, testing and acquiring weapon systems and platforms, and ensuring that the nation is successful in current operations. The Department of Defense is at a pivotal moment with respect to the development of strategy and operational concepts. The shift from nearly 2 decades of counterinsurgency to competition with near-peer competitors, namely China and Russia, set requirements for what the DoD and the services will need from service members for the coming decades. Just yesterday, the Secretary of Defense laid out recommendations from the China Task Force with a focus on future military personnel requirements. The development of operational concepts such as the Joint All-Domain Command and Control, the Army's multi-domain operations, and the Marine Corps Expeditionary Advanced Base Operations will further require new skill sets, including cyber and information dominance, while also requiring mastery of long-held military values, including physical prowess, mental clarity, and the ability to operate in ambiguity. Additionally, we're also witnessing a once-in-a-generation occurrence, the creation of an entirely new military service in the Space Force. Additionally, DoD and the services have some challenges to overcome in order to ensure that those who are highly qualified for military service are interested in military service. The services are currently facing issues of racism, sexual assault, and extremism within the ranks. Given that conservative estimates determine only 30% of American youth are qualified for military service, the Department of Defense must continue to ensure that all qualified candidates see military service as a viable option for themselves. The big question we're exploring in this year's panel is how the United States can best approach military recruitment in an era of competition. We'll begin with 3 audience questions, looking at population trends in the US and our near-peer competitors. We'll present the forecast for population trends in the US, China, and Russia in the year 2050, followed by geographic recruitment trends within the US. We'll use the audience polling feature to capture current perceptions about the state of US military recruitment. So we'll start with a first question in a moment, and you will have 1 minute to provide your answers through the polling box below. First question for the audience is, in the year 2050, who will have the largest military recruiting pool, the US, China, or Russia? You'll have a moment here to answer the question, and I'll provide some context as you think it through. When looking at demographic data from our near-peer competitors, a few trends emerge. First, the United States military is unique in that it maintains an all-volunteer force rather than a conscription force. China and Russia both operate under a conscription model. Military service is mandatory for all male Russian citizens who typically serve for one 12-month draft between ages 18 and 27. China also operates their military through obligatory service to the PLA. However, in practice, the PLA is able to meet their current requirements through a volunteer conscription model. In the event that conflict were to occur, however, the PLA would be able to access the entire male population. We'll now take a look at the polling results and see what the audience had to say. So good job, the audience, you answered correctly. The answer to this first question can be seen in the series of the next 3 graphics. If we look at the population of military recruits as being roughly the age group of 17 to 24-year-olds, we see that the United States will have roughly 88 million individuals in that age range in 2050. In the second graphic, we see that Russia will have roughly 14.6 million in that same age group. And lastly, we see that China will have 138 million individuals in that age group in 2050. So the answer to the first question is that China will have the largest population of potential military recruits in 2050. However, it is worth noting that there are societal differences in the ways each country uses the nation's demographics to meet military requirements. The United States, for example, includes more women among their ranks, and it's a demographic that continues to increase over time. The Chinese military, by contrast, has a much smaller representation of women at 4.5% of their overall military. Thus, when we're thinking through future conflicts, it is possible that the Chinese military will only access about half of the population they have available. So now we'll look more specifically at some trends within the US military recruiting pool. Again, you'll have 1 minute to answer the question and answer the audience poll below. So our second question is, where does the largest absolute number of military recruits come from by state? So the options that you have are California, Texas, North Carolina, and New York. And again, as you answer the question, I'll provide some context. When looking at the US military specifically, geographic representation is a key factor in ensuring a diverse set of backgrounds and experiences are represented throughout the ranks. This ensures not only geographic representation, but can also serve as a stand-in for other demographic factors to include political party, education levels, socioeconomic representation, and to a certain extent, race and ethnicity. The United States military spends vast amounts of resources to ensure that our military is representative of overall society. For example, the congressional nomination system for service academy acceptance ensures representation among graduates who commission into the officer corps from all states. In another example, the services spend a lot of resources to ensure representation among both the officer and enlisted corps from traditionally underrepresented areas such as the Northeast. So we'll now take a look at the audience answer and present a map that will provide a fuller story. So let's see how you all did. All right, so here is a little myth busting. The largest number of recruits actually comes from the state of California. There are roughly 18,000 individuals who were recruited in recruiting year 2016, which is the most recent year for which we have data available. California is followed by Texas, Florida, Georgia, and New York. The consistent factor here is that the largest absolute number of recruits come from the states with the largest populations, which is a bit intuitive. In some instances, however, it also reflects military basing presence and a strong history of military service across the southern states, particularly in Texas, Georgia, North Carolina, and Florida. Now we'll move on to our final audience question. On a per capita basis, which state do you think contributes the highest proportion of DoD recruits relative to its share of the 18 to 24-year-old market? Your options here are Texas, Alabama, Hawaii, and California. Again, you'll have 1 minute to answer the polling question below while I provide some context. Perhaps a more important distinction than the state with the highest absolute number of military recruits is the per capita representation of military recruits by state. This gives us a better sense of the relationship between the civilian population and its military recruits. Research demonstrates that military recruitment relies heavily on the role of community influencers, which extend beyond military recruiters to parents, teachers, school administrators and counselors, current members of the local Guard and Reserve units, and returning veterans. We also see a strong relationship in military recruitment within military families. Therefore, we expect to see some correlation between states with strong active duty military presence and the per capita rate of future military recruits. So let's see how you all did. And I have a feeling that the answer will be surprising. Okay, so the answer here is actually Hawaii. The ratio of civilians to military recruits has two factors there, and I think that's what's at play with Hawaii. In some ways, it reflects the fact that there are a large number of military installations in Hawaii, which exposes individuals to military service. It's also a factor of a smaller overall civilian population. But beyond this trend, what we see is that the per capita military recruitment trends across the United States reinforce some longstanding trends in military service. an overrepresentation from the South, such as South Carolina, Georgia, Virginia, and Texas, and an underrepresentation from Northeastern states like Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Vermont. So, given the strategic and long-term importance of building and sustaining the uniform talent pipeline needed to win the wars of the future, the Department of Defense and the military services must both capitalize on opportunities provided in current policy to recruit, retain, and manage talent. They will also need to confront a series of personnel-related issues affecting military recruitment and retention, such as sexual assault and racism. Our distinguished panelists today are in unique positions to address the topic at hand, and I'm pleased to serve as the panel's moderator. We are joined today by Bishop Garrison, who serves as the Senior Advisor to the Secretary of Defense for Human Capital and Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, Dr. Kori, who is the Director of Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute and author of Warriors and Citizens, American Views of Our Military. And finally, Lieutenant Colonel Garrett Kaye, in the United States Army, serves as the Los Angeles Recruiting Battalion Commander for the 6th Recruiting Brigade. We will start with 20 minutes of moderated questions, and then we'll jump into the audience questions. So if you have questions for the panelists, please enter them in the chat box below. So I'm going to start with Bishop Garrison. First, can you give us a sense, so you're the first senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense for Human Capital and Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Can you talk about how this position came to be and how it's tied to the department's operational mission?
Yes, and thank you for having me. It's an honor and a pleasure to be on such an esteemed panel. This came basically into fruition in the sense that the Secretary of Defense, Secretary Lloyd Austin, determined that one of his top priorities from the beginning would be diversity, equity, and inclusion within the ranks. We see that the military is made up approximately of about 43% of people of color today that are serving within uniform. And the broader population, when you talk about the total force, civilians and military, is roughly about 40%. So it's very important for us to ensure that we're creating an inclusive environment for all those who serve and wish to serve the United States. And to your point on a lot of the issues that you discussed early on in your audience questions about the potential pool of people that we're going to have to recruit from in the coming decades, it's incredibly important that we're doing everything we can to build the type of environment that will see multi-generational construct of individuals who want to come into the service, who want to dedicate their lives and their careers to the service of their nation. So making that a priority now ensures that in the next 10 to 20 years, we're going to have the ability to recruit those people into this new inclusive and welcoming culture.
That's great. Dr. Schake, a question for you. The U.S. military has been the most trusted public institution in the country for the past 20 years, and even longer than that. What risks do you see posed to that trust through issues of lack of representation or the existence of issues like sexual assault, racism, or extremism?
Yeah, it's a really good question. We hold our military to a different and higher standard than we hold other institutions. For example, the data on sexual harassment and sexual assaults for the age bands of people who make up the majority of the military, the last time I looked at the figures, they were actually lower for the military than on most university campuses, for example. So I think the first thing to know is that we hold our military to a higher standard than we hold other institutions and other parts of society. And that's part of the reason the public has such admiration and such trust. The second really important constituent element of that trust, and one that I worry is corroding, is the nonpartisan nature of our military. They don't get involved in politics. They don't take political positions. This has been
eroding for a long time. Like, it's not a recent phenomenon, although I believe it's accelerating. But from the time former Marine Commandant P.X. Kelly and former Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Crow, endorsed political candidates, two things have begun happening. The public's ability to distinguish between the active duty military and veterans is diminished. And second, the line is moving on public attitudes. Namely, the public is enthusiastic about veterans and even active duty military being engaged in partisan political activity, provided it supports the pre-existing views of their politics. So the public begins to look at the military the way they look at the Supreme Court, which is, I think they're nonpartisan when they agree with me, and I think they're disgracing the uniform or the legacy of the institution if they politically disagree with me. And what I think folks should conclude from that, or could conclude from that, is that the military has done a fabulous job of using its professionalism as a bulwark against politicization. But there is only so much the military can do as an institution to prevent that when we have such a high degree of politicization in American society writ large. Because the integral nature of the connection between our military and our society is what's creating that. But we actually don't want a military that isn't integrally connected to our broader society.
And Lieutenant Colonel Kaye, Bishop and Kori provided kind of a high-level perspective from a strategic and academic level, but you're engaged with military recruitment at the tactical level every day. What are some of the trends that you're seeing in military recruitment in your area or across the U.S. writ large?
Yeah, thank you, Kate. It really is an honor and a pleasure to be on this panel, and I really appreciate the invite. So I took command last summer, and I've been in the seat for almost a year now. So I say that because I've been a COVID commander more or less for my entire duration. And so when we start talking about trends, I think it's very important, because it's a challenge right now to dissect really what's temporary versus what are some more of those sweeping, broader changes. Because we can classify, what we're seeing with COVID as really kind of temporary, but recruiting in this environment is an enormous challenge right now, and a lot of those factors that Dr. Schake laid out have a lot to do with it. Some of those broader sweeping changes, but it's getting sort of wrapped up in the overall COVID environment, and so it's a struggle. And I think not until the COVID cloud fully lifts are we going to be able to look back and say what was some of those primary contributors to the struggle. But that being said, objectively, there's a few trends that are noteworthy, and first is the sort of the quantitative drop off. And again, this is where it gets wrapped into COVID a little bit. Making mission, we call it making mission in recruiting, right? We're given a quota every month and an annual mission. And it's always hard, even in the best of times. It's always hard. But right now, especially for Los Angeles, but for the whole command, we're about 20% less than generally what we're producing on a monthly basis. So that's just in terms of overall quantity. It's hard to find people that are interested right now. And again, a lot of that has to do with COVID and our access and all that. But another prevailing trend is the qualitative drop off. And of course, that's a little more concerning, especially when we're talking here in Los Angeles. It's hard. My recruiting formation is really good at finding people to potentially join the Army, but they're having quite the challenge finding interested and qualified people to join the Army, right? And so that's a combination of sort of mental aptitude, i.e. people who can pass the ASVAB, the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery, be it drug use, be it obesity, be it permanently disqualifying medical issues. All of these things are creating a pool of less quality right now. And, if we're just going to go in pure indicators, we track everything, of course, from leads we generate all the way down to the folks that we ship. And there's a place in the middle of the funnel called your test to test pass conversion. And that historically was pretty high for my battalion and for the command, depending on where you were. And that has taken a significant drop. So we're finding people, we're trying to get them to qualify, and they're just not qualified. So that's another concerning trend. And then lastly, I'll just talk about something a little more specific to my market, since we're talking a little bit about diversity and inclusion. So in the Los Angeles basin, so my battalion, its area of operations is Los Angeles County and Ventura County. About 10 million people, about 1 million qualified military applicants, roughly. But my area of operation is about 58% Hispanic, and so we track very closely we call it our P2P, which is our percentage to population, making sure that we're getting the right amount of folks representative of our market. And that took a hit over the last year. And so our percentage there in that particular demographic dropped. And again, when we're dissecting that permanent from the temporary issues, we know that we had a struggle early in the summer with the specialist Ilan case. And then the subsequent release of the Fort Hood report, and all of those things kind of impacted, I think, a little more aggressively the Hispanic community in my particular market, along with the higher rate of COVID transmission in that community. All these factors, again, trying to dissect that permanent from the temporary. But those are some of the prevailing trends that we're seeing. And I'll hand it back to you. Appreciate it.
That's great. Thank you. Back to Bishop. Might you tell us a bit about some of the initiatives that are currently underway in DoD and how you might measure whether they're successful? I think you're on mute.
It'd help if I unmuted myself. I'm sorry. Overall, without going into too much detail, as we continue to get a better understanding and sense of the totality of everything we've had in movement from late last year all the way through today. We have a variety of programs that are aimed at engaging local communities. To the Colonel's point, it's not only about enticing and building that connectivity, it's about showing what opportunities exist within service moving forward. It's our connection with HBCUs has been great, but it's not simply about workforce. So we're looking at opportunities to invest in their own infrastructure as they're building out research and development centers, as they're looking to become FFRDCs. That not only does that help you to build a pipeline of talent for individuals who could come and serve within the department, but it also creates that nexus, that necessary investment in the communities there that shows that the department is not simply looking for some type of an interchangeable relationship. They're looking to build roots and to establish themselves within the everyday lives of individuals. So looking at the potential of FFRDCs, looking at the potential of research and development centers, and then of course there is the more traditional sense of, well, what type of academic programs are in place for us to build pipelines at universities? What types of things are we building out in communities that can still have that tangible connection back to the future workforce that we will need to build out? So we're talking to different components within the department to determine what types of institutions, what types of entities can we look to put out in the communities to address some of these issues. So it's a very large construct when you think about a population of almost 3 million people within the department, and a variety of components to include the military departments in the Fourth Estate, that we're trying to get a grasp of not only what has been done, but moving forward into the future, what can be done. And when you start to continue to look at this and you talk about that future workforce that we mentioned, that's going to be a highly skilled, highly technical workforce to some degree as well. And I think the Colonel was hitting on that a bit as you talk about the backgrounds of individuals that we're looking to continue to recruit in. So what type of key factors, what type of key initiatives do we need to put into place now that take those types of issues into consideration? So that's a little bit of what we're trying to do across the board.
That's great. Dr. Schake, as the demographics of the U.S. change in the coming decades, what should the military take into consideration in order to maintain a strong connection and relationship with the general public?
So I actually think the American military is already great at this. We're seeing evidence of it actually on this panel, right? The Colonel's description of why there have been challenges of recruiting is actually a very sophisticated analysis. And because the military takes the recruiting challenge so seriously, and they take it so seriously because they want to be able to recruit high quality American soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and Coast Guardsmen. So yes, the demography of the country is changing, and yes, the military already has a lot of really creative ways. One of my personal favorites is allowing immigrants to the country to have accelerated paths to citizenship by military service, because I think immigrants, they come here for a reason, and most are overwhelmingly grateful for the opportunities they get in the United States. And they have a remarkable record of service to the country through the military. And so I love that we reward that with an accelerated path to citizenship. But there are a jillion ways in which we think about this, and I actually think the military doesn't get nearly enough credit. But again, you see that credit reflected in public appreciation for the military. The military does a better job than most other parts of American society at recruiting diversity, about thinking about creative ways to retain diversity. And so it's one of the real success stories of American society, even though there's lots of room for improvement. I think the baseline needs to be an acknowledgement that our military already does this really well.
If I could add one thing quickly, just to hit off Dr. Shake's point, which was an incredibly important one. We also are recruiting not simply diverse individuals, not simply for the sake of having more diverse individuals on board. The military and our military leaders have definitely identified that a lot of the complexity involved in the issues that we're dealing with today and in the future are going to really require innovative thought. And the way you get the most possible innovative thought is through a diversity of lived experience, a diversity of individuals within that room that can speak to a variety of beliefs, culturally, can speak to of tackling issues from a variety of different angles. So to her point, the military has been great about this for so long because we've had to engage in it constantly in order to ensure that we were a step above both our opponents, our competitors, and in times even our allies.
I've got a follow-up COVID question for Lieutenant Colonel Kaye. So how has COVID affected the way that military recruitment is conducted over your experience? Certainly it's affected the outcomes of recruiting.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it is something we're still, we're still addressing on a day-to-day basis. Over the last year, we've had to do nothing but adapt quickly. And generally, the military is pretty good at that. It's one of our strong suits. But recruiting is a people business, and it's about rapport building. And so some of the measures we took still haven't completely bridged the gap between the way we used to do it and the way we're kind of being forced to do it now. I think we addressed it as in true military fashion, with risk to force and risk to mission, force being our own recruiters. And of course, this is, we had to bring, during the initial onset of it, and I'll just start there, everybody went virtual, being, teleworking, all of our recruiters. And it was very difficult to get the work ethic, I think, that we needed to make the numbers that we needed. And so as safely as we could, in accordance with local authorities, we brought everybody back into the stations, into the brick and mortar stations. And even though we weren't doing necessarily face-to-face recruiting with the community, we needed that sort of direct supervision, because at the end of the day, it's still, non-commissioned officers who are our primary recruiters, and they need some of that guidance, direction, and supervision. As autonomous and as great as they are, we still needed people in the building. So we've been mission essential, going back to maybe a month or two into COVID. And then it's been from there, to address your primary question on the how. Speaking especially from the Los Angeles perspective, we have not had until the last month or so any schools in session whatsoever, and that is historically the most fertile recruiting grounds for recruiting NCOs. We developed very deliberate school recruiting plans, and to not be able to access the schools was the most significant challenge that we had to overcome. And the second most significant challenge would be our inability to generate any interest or awareness. As you laid out beautifully in the beginning, there are areas in the country, surrounded by military installations, active duty, large formations where that awareness is already generated. But in areas, that we're struggling per se, like in Los Angeles, where there is no active duty, installation. Your closest one is the National Training Center, halfway between LA and Vegas. Nobody sees active duty folks. You need to be able to generate events and generate interest and show the community, the Army. And so we weren't able to do either of those things. And a lot of that is kind of wrapped up into what I was talking about in terms of the quantitative drop that we've seen. But in the true how, it's been all about virtual recruiting, i.e. social media. All of our recruiters are active on social media. It's where Generation Z is. We've only been really we've been working on it for quite some time, but we had to step on the accelerator the second we couldn't do anything face to face. And so, and it's something that's trained at the schoolhouse now. And so social media primarily, virtual job fairs on a variety of different platforms. We experiment with almost all of them, be it Indeed, Brazen, Premier. We're doing one right now. And then we had to get back to the true blue, as painful as it is, call it telephonic prospecting. And it's not what our recruiting NCOs love to do, but they have to pick up the phone and they have to call. And in this era with phone ID and all that, it's not an easy business. And so we are, even though we've made great strides in virtual prospecting and we've maintained our proficiency in telephonic prospecting, we can't wait to be able to get back to the schools and be able to face-to-face, because at the end of the day, especially when you can't, when you don't have an installation, those recruiters, when they go into the schools and get to demonstrate their passion and demonstrate what the Army did for them, that's how that rapport is really built, and that's what entices people to want to be like that. And without that, it's still gonna be a challenge out there. So back to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So I'll shift to a couple of questions for the panel writ large, and I'll be shifting through some of the questions as well from the audience. So first, we've all watched the debates unfold in recent months and even in the last week regarding initiatives that are intended to recruit and retain those Americans who are qualified and interested in military service. And in some corners, that has been criticized as woke policies, or the debate over whether the military can still be seen as a meritocracy, if it ever was. So how might you respond to these critiques, or phrased another way, what operational advantages do we see when the military is truly representative of broader society, particularly in terms of race and gender? So I'll throw that out to the panel.
So maybe I'll start. I think Bishop made a really good point about diversity creating better problem-solving teams. And I think that's one really important response to those like Senator Cruz who want the military only to be, people who could carry a howitzer shell by themselves. That we do actually need a diversity of skills in our military, and we need them for mission essential purposes. The second thing, the thing that everybody needs to be reminded of, is that the military is actually good at recruiting, and they're not trying to recruit Ted Cruz. They're trying to recruit today's 18-year-olds. And so if you think you can do a better job than the military is doing on recruiting, by all means, come aboard and go let Lieutenant Colonel Kaye put you to work on the telephone. Because mostly it's old people complaining that the world's changing around them. And these kids these days, incidentally, in that recruiting commercial, are serving soldiers, right? So I think it's deeply regrettable and actually shameful of comments like that of Senator Cruz that, these are people who have no place in our army. It's really bad to drag our military into the culture wars that our politics appear consumed with, rather than issues of governance right now. It's a terrible thing to do to our military, and actually I think an unpatriotic thing to do to our military.
I'll take this up as well. I to reiterate something that the Secretary of Defense has said on a regular occasion, we want to ensure that we have a welcoming, inclusive environment for anyone who is able-bodied and wishes to serve. No one should be discriminated against for any reason outside of the fact that they physically wouldn't be able to help us complete our mission. If you want to be here and you want to fight and you want to serve, you should absolutely have the opportunity to do so. A part of Dr. Shaki's point, we're continuing to see our own society shift. We're continuing to see, as we have in every generation. I don't think we're seeing anything particularly new here as well. And particularly the individuals that we are attempting to recruit into the foundational base of our military are young 17, 18-year-olds. So we're going to do everything we can to ensure that they feel welcome, to ensure that they want to be a part of the world, the greatest military in the history of the world. Why would we not want to do everything we can to ensure that individuals want to be a part of this institution and want to continue to come into our ranks? So that when we do have, God forbid, the next major issue, whether kinetic or otherwise, that faces us, we will have the absolute deepest pool of talent to recruit from, regardless of those individuals' backgrounds, what they look like, what they believe. I personally don't care. I want anyone who wants to fight, who is willing to fight, who is not going to go against the good order and discipline of units or the cohesion that commanders and their senior enlisted leaders need in order to maintain discipline and to move forward with their missions. As long as those individuals are going to be able to live and to work with their fellow service members within those parameters, I don't care what they believe. I don't care what their backgrounds are. They need to just come and help us serve. So the marketing and the efforts that you're seeing today have resonated as we're continuing to hear with this younger generation, regardless to her point of what some of us older ones, I guess I'm pretty old myself now at this point, but what some of us older ones might believe. It's about how we can at least get them introduced to the military and how we can get them interested for the potential of a career, because we want to ensure that anyone who can comes and has the opportunity to serve.
I don't have a whole lot to add. Those are both brilliant answers. Really, it's about expanding the talent pool, right? And we have 150 different jobs in the United States Army. Infantry is one of them, and those that are propense for service in combat arms, we don't really have that much of a problem with. We've been targeting, or don't want to use a target, but marketing and working with those sort of propense folks for a while, but our talent pool was small. And so by doing this, not only do we get to hopefully bridge the relatability gap that we have with Generation Z, but we have to expand the talent pool to create awareness amongst those that would never have given it a thought prior to this approach. So I applaud the campaign for doing something a little more innovative and for doing something to address this relatability gap, because Generation Z just doesn't have the same familial military experience with their parents or brothers or sisters or friends serving, and so we need to reach out to them in different ways beyond the traditional means. Those that are already propense to serve, we're probably going to talk to at some point, and they're going to end up joining one of the services. It's those that are less propense that we need to at least let them think that military service is an option, and that's where that inclusivity and diversity and reaching out to all is so important.
That's great. So one last question before we wrap and hand it off to the next panel. We've addressed a number of issues that result from DoD internal policies, but there are also efforts underway within the administration writ large and the interagency, as well as legislation from Congress, for example, the Equality Act. How do these broader efforts help reinforce or assist the work that's currently underway at DoD?
Bishop, I feel like
I think I can take that. No, sorry. Well, in particular, it just goes to reinforce a lot of the long-standing beliefs of leadership within the department. When we already know that we have long been an institution that looks for equity and equality in everything that we do, and it helps to hear that from the largest, the top ranks of leadership across the board. So when you, and particularly when we talk about things like everything from women in combat and understanding that it provides them for more opportunities moving forward in their own career progression, to lifting the transgender ban, back to our original point of having a more diverse group of individuals to pull into, it further demonstrates, one, from a societal perspective, that we want to engage in some level of change and make ourselves a more inclusive, welcoming environment. And at the same time, we're going to continue to see that resonate as the military continues to be, to some degree, a reflection of society at large. So I think seeing those types of efforts continue to reinforce this. I can tell you one in particular. It goes back to January, executive order from the White House that had a focus on equal opportunity and equity across the board, and it re-envisioned how we think about equal opportunity and about DEI initiatives. It looked to build opportunities to success and not simply look for pure representation in what we do, meaning that it goes back again to some of the earlier points I think all three of us made at this stage, that we need to look for new and innovative ways to build those bridges to service, because a lot of Generation Z and future generations are not seeing the same familial connection that we've seen previously. I am a veteran. My father was a veteran. My grandfather was a veteran. We're not seeing that in the exact same way. So building out connections to the community through equity, not just, hey, let's come recruit you, come and work with us, but hey, we're here in your community to work with you. And as well as you having the opportunity to then, should you choose, come back and serve. I think it makes it much less of a transactional relationship and shows that we really are trying to invest in deep roots into these communities to build exactly what Lieutenant Colonel Kaye, I think, was aiming for there too.
Well, wonderful. Thank you to all of our panelists for participating in this conversation, as well as to our audience members for your participation and your thought-provoking questions. We'll be followed immediately by my colleague Andrea Kendall-Taylor's panel on Russia and assumptions check. Again, we encourage you to continue following along for each of the conference events, and you can participate through the hashtag CNAS 2021 or by visiting conference.cnas.org for more information. Andrea, we look forward to hearing all that your panel has to bring today.
Thanks, Kate. That was an awesome session. So just want to welcome everyone. For those of you who are joining newly, welcome. For those of you who have stayed on from the previous panel, welcome to our session. As Kate said, we're here to do Russia, a key assumptions check. And basically in the next 30 minutes, the group of speakers that we have lined up, we're going to take on head on the widely held assumption that Russia is a declining power. So if we can bring up our slide and the rest of the crew, and we'll get started. So basically our starting point is that we've observed that there is this very pervasive assumption that Russia is a declining power. It's gained significant traction with policymakers and academics alike. And you can see some of that from some of the quotes that we've got up on this slide. It's pervasive, and B, it's been around for a really long time. So for example, you'll see up here a quote from 2014 from then President Barack Obama, who described Russia as a quote unquote regional power. That same year, the late Senator John McCain described Russia on the Senate floor as a gas station masquerading as a country. You even have kind of British historian back in 2011 saying that Vladimir Putin's Russia is in decline and on its way to global irrelevance. So really the reality is that this assumption has been around really since the end of the Cold War. The West has continuously thought about Russia as a declining power. And yet here we are. We're still here in a situation where Russia has sustained its capacity for confrontation and disruption. It has demonstrated that it has the political will to use the tools that it has at its disposal, and it remains one of Washington's primary adversaries. So what we want to do, again, in the next 30 minutes is basically to use this session to examine this very fundamental assumption that Russia is a declining power. And we're going to do that by tackling four kind of sub-assumptions, or kind of four more narrowly scoped, more specific assumptions that underpin that broader assumption about Russia as a declining power. So we're going to look at the commonly held views about Russia's economy. We're going to talk about Russia's technological capabilities. We're going to look at beliefs about Russia's projected military power. And finally, we're going to talk about Russian leadership. So we have a really fantastic lineup of speakers. We're going to start with Eddie Fishman on Russia's economy. We've got Rita Konaev on projections about Russia's technological capacity. We've got Mike Kofman, who's going to talk to us about Russian military power. And then at the very end, you're going to hear from me again on Russian leadership. And again, so we're going to walk you through each of these four kind of sub-assumptions that people make that support that larger assumption about Russia being a declining power. I want to make very good use of the next 30 minutes. So rather than doing introductions of each of our panelists, you can find their bios on the CNAS conference website, either on our speaker page or on our session page. And I think one of my colleagues will drop in a link to where you can find each of their bios. So welcome, everyone. Welcome, Eddie and Rita and Mike. It's great to have you here. Okay, so to kick things off, we're actually going to turn to the audience first. And we want to hear all of your assessments about Russia's trajectory, and we're going to look out over the next 7 to 10 years. And so what I want all of our audience to do is to use the polling function and to respond to the prompt that you see on the slide. So we're all asking you about whether you strongly agree, whether you agree, whether you disagree, or whether you strongly disagree with the notion that Russia is a declining power. And I think for those of you, I think if you look below the video stream, you're going to see the chat box. Basically, you just have to enter your name there to join the chat and respond to the poll. So please, everyone, take a minute to go ahead and respond to that poll now. And while you're doing that, I just kind of want to take a second and just be really explicit about the goals of the session. So I want to say clearly that our goal isn't really to debunk the assumption that Russia is a declining power. We're not really here to claim that Russia's some supergiant that we all need to be afraid of. But instead, I think what we want to do is show that things are much more nuanced than is widely believed. Some assumptions about Russia simply don't stand up to the current evidence. And in some cases we do. And so we basically want to be able to have that conversation. I think all of us think that the United States has to have this more nuanced, clear-eyed discussion about the challenges that Russia actually posed to the United States. Because it's important for policymakers, I think, to right-size Russia in our national security priorities, right? We don't want to overstate the threats and the risks and the challenges that Russia pose, because that takes up valuable time at high levels of our policy process. It takes up resources, but nor do we want to underestimate the challenge. We don't want, and nor do we want to kind of be caught in a mindset where where Russia's capacity and capabilities are declining, that it's simply something that we can overlook or wait Russia out. So the goal of this is really just to have that more nuanced discussion so that we can right-size our thinking about Russia and then the policy responses that we develop to confront and compete with Russia. All right, so with that, let's wrap up our polling, and we're going to get started with each of our speakers. And we're going to kick things off with Eddie Fishman, and he's talking about Russia's economy. And Eddie is going to be taking on the assumption. So if we turn, there we go, we've got it up. Okay, so Eddie's taking on, and this is the assumption: Russia's economy will remain stagnant and sanctions will limit prospects for growth. So over to you, Eddie, to kind of give your assessment and your analysis.
Well, thank you, Andrea. It has become common, I think, in recent years to think of Russia's economy as a basket case, plagued by policy mismanagement and stunted by exogenous factors, such as a global shift away from fossil fuels and persistent international sanctions. And these assumptions are important because they underpin this assumption that Russia is a declining power, as well as contentions that Russia is not a great power at all. But I think they're ultimately misleading. A caricature that exaggerates Russia's weaknesses and undermines its strengths. First, let's probe whether Russia's economy is actually mismanaged. I think in many ways it is. Russia's economy is rife with corruption, cronyism, and dominated by politically connected state-owned enterprises. But from the perspective of fiscal and monetary policy, Russia's actually done a good job in recent years getting its house in order. After 2014, when Russia sanctions were put in place following the invasion of Ukraine, Russia's economy tumbled. Also, oil prices collapsed. But Russia responded by reining in budgets and really with a disciplined fiscal policy that led to years of budget surpluses. And today, Russia actually sits in a good position. $185 billion are in the National Wealth Fund, and hard currency reserves hover near $600 billion. And this war chest has really allowed Russia to buoy its economy throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. Russia also responded in 2014 with an import substitution policy that hurt Russian consumers, but has led to a booming agricultural sector domestically that now accounts for nearly $30 billion of exports every year. Finally, Russia also pivoted its economy to Asia, and this has been quite successful. Since 2014, the share of Russian trade that is made up in bilateral trade with China has doubled. It's now over $100 million and is projected to eclipse $200 billion by 2025. So I think it's important to note, Russia's economy has not been kind to everyday Russians. I believe that real disposable incomes have declined as much as 10% since the Crimea annexation. So it's not been a great time to be a regular everyday Russian. But I think from a macro level, Russia's actually in solid shape. And I wouldn't suspect that the economy would curtail Russia's ability to project power. Second, I want to go back to some of these exogenous factors I mentioned, climate change and sanctions. Certainly on climate change, oil and gas make up 40% of Russia's budget. So a major shift away from oil and gas would not be good for Russia. That said, I think it's important to note that Russia is quite resilient against any major shift away from oil and gas because it's one of the world's lowest cost energy producers. The Russian budget breaks even at $40 a barrel, which is about half of where Saudi Arabia's budget breaks even. And if you recall last year in the Saudi-Russia oil price war, Russia is very comfortable with low oil prices. And I believe Russian oil producers can be profitable at prices probably as low as $15 a barrel. So I think even if oil demand does go down, and by the way, we don't yet see that in data, I think Russian oil will probably be sold on the market until that very last barrel of oil is sold, whenever that happens. Finally, I want to touch on sanctions. I think this is a really important topic because it's so commonly misunderstood. Certainly in 2014, when US and European sanctions went into place, the Russian economy was in real damage. Multiple points knocked off of GDP for several years. But during the 4 years that Trump was in the White House, sanctions were stagnant, completely stagnant. And as a result, the Russian economy adapted and returned to growth during the Trump years. I'd also note that even from the beginning, Russia's sanctions were, by design, pretty light. And this is because US and European policymakers didn't want spillovers into the global economy. For comparison's sake, take Iran sanctions, another sort of paradigmatic sanctions case. Every major Iranian oil company and bank, and even the central bank of Iran, is under full blocking sanctions. That means they're prohibited from any dealings in US dollars or in the US financial system. By contrast, not a single major Russian state-owned enterprise, not a single major oil company, not a single major gas company, not a single major bank is under full blocking sanctions. And I think that this is a really important comparison because they're not really on the same level. If Iran sanctions are a 10 out of 10 in intensity, if North Korea or Venezuela sanctions maybe are an 8 out of 10, the Russia sanctions are probably a 2, maybe at best a 3. I think the bottom line on sanctions is that they probably will cap Russia's prospects for growth. Certainly Russia, the economy would be better if there were no sanctions, and foreign direct investment has suffered during the period of sanctions. But I don't think they're significant enough to fundamentally curtail Russian power. And to be honest, they weren't designed to curtail Russian power. So where does this leave us? At a high level, Russia's economic prospects are not so grim as to condemn Russia to some sort of inexorable decline. But I do think there is one valuable and important lens to bring up, which is the lens of opportunity cost. Certainly, if Russia were to root out corruption and cronyism and actually impose economic policies that allowed everyday Russians to achieve their full potential, Russia could be a much greater power than it is today. Thank you, and back to you, Andrea.
Eddie, that was awesome. Thanks for that. So now we're going to shift gears. And again, we're flying through this in 30 minutes. We're taking on a lot, but we're shifting gears to the technology domain. And I'm going to hand it over to Rita Konaev, who's going to take on this assumption that Russia is not a technological leader. So over to you, Rita.
Thank you, Andrea. Indeed, you're right. There really is a common assumption that Russia is not a technological leader. And especially when it comes to discussions and conversations that we're having about innovation in emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, for instance, Russia really even factors into what seems to be a two-horse race between the United States and China. And I will start by saying that to a great extent, there are some merits to this argument. There are good foundations there. Let's start with the fact that given the combined impact that the economic and demographic challenges that Russia is facing, it continues to struggle to develop, to retain, and to attract talent, specifically those highly skilled, tech-savvy individuals who fuel innovation. The science and technology sector in Russia is chronically underfunded by the government, and the private sector barely plays a role in research and development in the same way that it does in the United States or in China. There's a broader societal problems like bureaucratic mismanagement, outdated regulations, and as Eddie mentioned, systemic corruption. These are all significant obstacles when it comes to technological innovation. If you look at AI, for example, into artificial intelligence, Russia lags behind the United States and China in things like hardware, data, again, talent, investment, and in outputs like research publications that are related to artificial intelligence. All of these metrics that contribute, enhance, promote innovation. Now, having said this, I'm still going to argue that this assumption that Russia is not a technological leader is not only incorrect, it's possibly irrelevant when it comes to our thinking about national security and the strategic competition writ large. So Why am I thinking this? Let's start by saying that for all of this talk that Russia is lagging behind in innovation, it still ranks among the top 10 nations in terms of its investments in research and development and its commitment to its science and technology sector. There's also very notable and promising and exciting private sector innovation in areas such as facial recognition, natural language processing, speech recognition technologies, as well as robotics. These startups in the Russian private sector and its AI ecosystems are winning international competitions, and they're also winning US-led competitions, including competitions that are set up by the US Department of Defense. Which brings me to a short statement that I want to make about innovation specifically in defense technology. Russian military modernization efforts have prioritized investments in emerging technologies in things like unmanned and autonomous vehicles. So think drones, ground vehicles, undersea vehicles that are seeing more autonomy, more AI-enabled capabilities. They're progressing to promote automated command and control, automation and AI for electronic warfare. And they're also investing in machine learning tools that can increase the scope and the impact of cyber warfare and information operations. Moreover, it's important to note that about 200 next-generation weapons and systems have been tested by the Russian military in combat or near-combat conditions in Syria. That is something that the US military is quite reluctant to do, meaning to test new weapons in operational conditions on its deployment. And China has no experience with something like that in recent memory. So really here, when the rubber meets the road, Russia may even be ahead of the United States and China when it comes to the operational testing of new defense technologies. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, and perhaps the most compelling reason to doubt this assumption that Russia is not a technological leader, and really to ask whether it is in fact even relevant to us, is Russia's successful proven record of significant election interference across the world and hundreds, if not thousands, of cyber attacks that it has executed. So this is to say that Russia does not need to be a technological superpower or a technological leader even to use emerging technologies to advance its interests in ways that undermine US interests. Over to you, Andrea.
Awesome, Rita, that was great. All right, so now that we've covered economy and whether or not that constrains military power, the technology and technological innovation, I'm going to turn it over to Mike Kofman, who's taking on this assumption, which is that Russia's military can't keep up with the competition and its economic and demographic trajectories will constrain the Kremlin's ability to sustain its aggression. So Mike, over to you.
Thanks, Andrea. I'm going to follow up my colleague's great remarks by focusing on the military side of the equation and the demographic side. And my argument is, look, Russia is not 10 feet tall, but it's very much not 4 feet tall either. Its military power is objectively not declining, and demographic constraints are not deterministic. In fact, they're not going to shape any of those things that we really find problematic about Russia in the future. So first, while some popular comparisons suggest Russian defense spending as being barely $60 billion per year, in reality, Russia's effective military expenditure is somewhere around $150 to $180 billion per year when we use much more accurate, adjusted purchasing power parity-based measures. And this, by the way, is just a conservative estimate. Naturally, Russia buys things in rubles from its own defense industry. Its defense sector is largely self-sufficient, and it doesn't convert that money into dollars to buy its equipment from the United States, like Saudi Arabia might. We often use figures that misrepresent Russian defense spending, usually understating it by as much as 2 to 3 times, and often suggesting that it's even smaller than the UK's defense budget. Well, you can look at the UK's military and Russian military, make an obvious assessment of which one is much larger than the other. Russia spends a much higher share on procurement and modernization. More than 30% of its military expenditure goes to that. And since 2011, it's gone through a substantial recapitalization of its conventional forces, expanding that structure, raised levels of readiness, and even engaged in a broad nuclear modernization program. So Russia has been sustainably spending more than 4% of its GDP on military expenditure through the worst of an economic recession, low oil prices, and Western sanctions. Nothing has dented it, in part because the Russian state prioritizes defense over public welfare. In short, Russia spends more than several major European powers combined, gets a lot more for its money and has been doing this all throughout the past decade when it was supposedly in decline as a power. The main constraint on Russian military is not money. It's actually defense industrial capacity to absorb the money they're trying to spend. In technology, Russia has actually closed the gap considerably in conventional capability over the past 10 years with the United States, and in a number of technologies that many defense analysts think is defining for modern warfare. For example, hypersonic weapons, electronic warfare, directed energy weapons, offensive cyber capabilities, advanced platforms for warfare in the undersea domain, counterspace systems. The list can go on and on. In all these, Russia can be thought of as either a near peer or a very significant competitor, while retaining traditional advantages in nuclear weapons. So it won't supersede the US in conventional capability, but definitely has enough power to deter the United States and NATO and be a sustainable challenger in the military realm. Now, if we turn to demographics, the truth is that Russia's expected population decline is much lower than some of the doomsday scenarios often offered out there in popular accounts. Median scenarios show that by 2050, Russia's population will decline by some 7 to 10%. So Russia is going to go from being by far the most populous country in Europe to being by far the most populous country in Europe. The outlook for Russian demographics has actually gotten much better over the past 20 years. Meanwhile, Russian manpower availability for military service is actually going to be increasing through 2033 rather than declining. In general, there's no evidence that population decline will make Russia less of a threat or constrain it meaningfully down the line in the future, especially in the areas that we care about. What matters in population ultimately is not quantity, it's quality. Although we still use many measures of power today as though we live in the 1920s as opposed to the 2020s, and we tend to focus on demographic quantity. We are not large agrarian economies with mass mobilization armies. It doesn't matter all that much for that question. Actually, the quality of Russia's population has improved substantially across most indicators. Yes, Russia lags Western countries in many demographic indicators, but it's tremendously improved the health, productivity, lifespan, and fertility of its population over the last 20 years. And we need to think a lot harder about the relevance of demographics to state power in general. So if you think of all the things that make Russia a challenge or problematic for the United States, whether it's cyber capabilities, various forms of indirect warfare, nuclear weapons, or boutique advanced conventional military capabilities, none of them are going to decline because of Russia's problematic demographic future, and there's also nothing deterministic about the demographic future in Russia. Finally, it's important we stop assessing Russia as a declining power relative to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is gone. It's actually been more than 30 years now, right? We have to look at Russia in part relative to itself and relative to other countries like the United States and China. And keep in mind, what matters is not just resources, but the power to attain outcomes. There's power over others in international politics. And in relative terms, Russia does not appear to be declining in global influence. So be wary of these declining sentiments because Russia has been written off time and time again in history and condemned to global irrelevance more than once, only to come back. Historically, Russia defies secular trends, and we should be cautious in these kind of proclamations. Thanks. And with that, I'll turn it over back to my colleague, Andrea.
Awesome. Okay, so I'm going to back clean up, and I just want to say a couple words about Russian leadership. I would say I think what we've heard in our discussion is really not so much a story of Russia in decline, but perhaps a story about stagnation. And so then the question becomes, could Russian leadership make choices that would set Russia on a different path? And so I'm going to hit this point, and if you can bring up the final assumption, please. Which basically says Russia's leadership is unlikely to make the changes it needs to remain competitive. And I think this is one area where this assumption holds considerable merit. Putin, for one, has been in power for 20 years. He has very firmly held views of the United States, and his foreign policy thinking, I think, is unlikely to change. And domestically, Putin has basically built a system, built an economy in particular, that benefits a few. It's a system of patronage where only a few benefit, where everyday Russians do not. But he would be hesitant and very unlikely to make significant reforms that would basically undermine that system because it would threaten his very hold on power. And so for me, it is unlikely that under Putin there would be any significant changes that would put Russia on a significantly different course. But two extra points I wanted to make, because then the question becomes, well, then how long is Putin going to remain in power? And here we've been doing some new work analyzing all authoritarian regimes where you've had leaders in power for 20 years or longer and that look most like Putin's personalist system. And when you look at those leaders in the post-Cold War era, the typical personalist or the typical dictator who is at least 65 years or older, which Putin is, and in power more than 20 years, if they made it to the 20-year mark, they're most likely to make it to the 30-year mark. And when we narrow that down and look at the personalist leaders, so even more like the Putin system, if those leaders have made it to the 20-year mark, then the average is that they end up governing for 36 years. So that's 16 more years or 15 more years, basically, of President Putin in power. One other thing that we have looked at is what happens when leaders like Putin pursue term limit extensions. So we all know he changed the Constitution. He could stay on till 2036. And when you look at all leaders, again, in the post-Cold War era, and there were 13 of them that changed term limits, almost all of them either went on from the moment that they changed the Constitution to govern 10 more years, or they died in power. So I think that the story here is that Putin is likely to be around for some time to come, which would significantly delay any significant reforms or changes to Russia's current trajectory. And then the question becomes, well, what about after Putin? So sure, things can happen. And so we looked at what happens after these longtime leaders have ruled a country. What happens after they go? And in 76% of cases, and again, this is in the post-Cold War era, either the regime persists or you get a new form of authoritarianism. And there is just that's a very different statistic. If you look at leaders who are in power 20 years, then the chances of democratization are much higher at about 48%. So again, here the moral of the story is where you have a leader in power this long, they've eviscerated institutions, the ground isn't really right for a more kind of liberal, more representative form of government to take root. And so I think the argument very much is that the type of leadership that we see in Russia today is likely to persist for some time to come. Again, these are baseline odds, but just to give us kind of that baseline of what to expect. Okay, so with that, we have now successfully run through all four of our sub-assumptions. And what I want to do is basically close this session the way that we started it, and that's with a final audience poll. So you'll see here, Russia is a declining power. We're asking you all to answer this question again. And we're curious to see if anyone's previous attitudes going into this session have changed at all. So please fill out the poll once again. Again, look under the chat, find the button that says vote. And we'll give everyone a second to fill that out. And while they do, I want to give our panelists the opportunity, anything that you missed, anything that you heard your colleagues say that you want to amplify, anything you want to add to the conversation just while people are filling out the poll. Mike,
sure,
Eddie?
I'm happy to add something. So I think Mike made a good point about purchasing power parity. You know, you often hear, oh, Russia's economy is smaller than Italy's, right? And in terms of nominal GDP, that's true. But if you look at it from a purchasing power parity perspective, Russia is actually the 6th largest economy in the world and quite comparable with Germany. So again, I think that oftentimes some of these data and statistics are thrown out there, to undermine or undersell Russian power, but really they're just a convenient way to pretend that Russia actually isn't a great power, when I think, in fact, it still is and will be for a time to come.
That great point, Eddie. And I actually, we did have a couple of questions trickle in. So one, and Mike, maybe I'm going to direct this to you, that talks about kind of the costs of Russia's military adventurism abroad. Is that something that has the potential to kind of drain reserves or hurt the economy? Or, what's that relationship look like? Can they sustain this international adventurism?
Yeah, absolutely. So the short answer is not really. Russia's military operations abroad are quite cheap if you look at their deployments. For example, if we look at the main expeditionary operation in Syria, that may cost as much as maybe $5 billion per year, but that's nothing to a very large power and a massive budget like Russia's. And they don't see it as a cost. They actually see this as one of the principal forms of training where everybody in Russian military has to go to get experience and rank up. It's amazing, actually, if you're a country and you're not vested in nation building, right? You're not engaging in prolonged trillion-dollar expeditionary operation type projects. Like, actually, they do it quite on the cheap. So it's not draining the Russian military, and it's not draining the Russian military budget. It is sustainable, and it's important for folks to appreciate this, that Russia's military spending and the percentage of GDP it commits to defense spending, it has gone through the worst periods in terms of recession and sanctions. It can go on, and it will. Russia is a long-term military competitor, and it can actually take on a larger global role if it wants to.
All right, so the results are loaded. So we're gonna just do a quick before and after to kind of see how we did. So if you wanna go ahead and bring up that final slide. So we at least brought down the strongly agrees from 7 to 0. The agrees went down a little, and here we go. We did a good job on the disagree and about the same on the strongly disagree, but very interesting. So I think we've moved in the right direction. And again, the point here is like Mike said, is not to say that Russia is 10 feet tall, but I think that it's just to say that we need to have this more nuanced understanding about the future challenge that Russia is going to pose to the United States. We need to shed some of these misperceptions about the nature of the Russia threat so that we can develop more effective policies for navigating Russia over the long term. It's not a country that is necessarily in decline. It is much more a picture of stagnation. We can't wait Russia out, and so we need to develop policies that are going to be effective for the long haul. So with that, in 30 minutes, I think we covered a tremendous amount of ground. It was a lot of fun. Thanks, Mike and Eddie and Rita, for doing it. And we're looking forward to continuing this conversation. Stay tuned for future CNAS research on this topic, all with Mike and Eddie and Rita, hopefully to come. And with that, I want to turn it over to my colleague, Ilan Goldenberg. We have our next session that will start immediately here on America in the Middle East. And there's Ilan. And over to you.
Thanks, Andrea. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. That was a great session. I was fascinated listening to that. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. I think what we're going to do today is talk for a little while, or at least I am, about what a sustainable U.S. approach to the Middle East could look like. The Biden administration came in focused on the Indo-Pacific, COVID-19, the economy, rebuilding relationships with our allies. The reality is the Middle East is not really a central priority for the incoming administration, nor should it be. But it also hasn't been a central priority for the last 3 incoming administrations. And each time we've gotten sucked back in, and it's taken up a remarkable amount of time. So some people say that that's because you can't avoid the Middle East. It will suck you back in no matter what, even if you try and leave it. I disagree. I don't think that's actually true. I think it's actually a function of bad American policy, what I call the American yo-yo diet in the Middle East. And so there it is, the American yo-yo diet. So, if we were smarter about the Middle East, we could manage our very real interests in the region while avoid getting drawn into the region in an unhealthy way, right? So let me try to explain what the yo-yo diet is. It's basically a phenomenon where for the past 20 years, we've been trying to leave the Middle East. We go on a crash diet to get out. Everything collapses and implodes, and then we come binging back in. And it goes back a number of administrations. George W. Bush comes in, and his whole campaign was, at least the foreign policy piece, was about not being the policeman of the world, stopping with these small wars and focusing on Russia and China. I don't know if that sounds familiar. But then just months into his presidency, we have the 9/11 attacks, and his entire presidency is sucked up by Iraq and Afghanistan. And this was at least partially a problem with American policy. I mean, I don't know if things would have been different if there'd been an earlier focus on Al-Qaeda in the beginning of the Bush administration or not. And it wasn't the only reason, but it is true that, this was not seen as a priority coming in, and that probably had at least some impact on the decisions made in those early months. So then Barack Obama comes in, and Barack Obama says, we've gotten too sucked in by Iraq. We need to withdraw. And that's what he campaigns on. It's a centerpiece of his campaign. And eventually we do withdraw from Iraq. We pivot to Asia, and just a couple years later, ISIS emerges, and the Obama administration gets sucked back in. And again, I think ISIS might have emerged no matter what, but the fact that we went to 0 troops in Iraq meant that we really had no understanding or warning, didn't see this coming early enough, and had a much worse problem on our hands when we did have to engage on it. And it's not as though we put thousands of troops back into the Middle East. We actually, like, the numbers were somewhat limited, but the amount of senior leadership time that this issue sucked up during the later years of the Obama administration was more than any other foreign policy issue. So again, basically crash diet followed by a binge. And now Donald Trump basically did the same thing. He comes in saying he wants to get out of the wars in the Middle East. And we have the 2018 National Defense Strategy, which really puts great power competition at the center. But then we have this Iran policy, which is highly escalatory, leads to significant escalation with Iran, culminating in the killing of IRGC Quds Force leader Qasem Soleimani, and Iranian missile attacks on U.S. bases. And by the end of the Trump administration, again, U.S. forces in the Middle East are higher than they were at the beginning of the Trump administration, with a very significant level. And now it's early in the Biden administration. It's unclear if they're going to be able to avoid this mistake again. But you did get a little bit of a taste for it a few weeks ago, right? Where, again, the administration was very clear about the Israeli-Palestinian issue not being a priority. They weren't going to get sucked into that issue the way previous administrations did. But you had this conflict between Israel and Hamas, sucked up, again, a lot of the president's time and a lot of his national security team's time for a week there. I think they handled the conflict itself pretty well. But again, you have to wonder if there had been a little more focus earlier, especially when things were bubbling in Jerusalem in the weeks before, perhaps we could have headed off the conflict in the first place. So what do we need to do? Basically, we need to get away from this yo-yo diet and move towards what I call a healthy, sustainable approach to the Middle East, right? I mean, this is what we need. What we really need is a square diet for the Middle East when it comes to U.S. foreign policy. I mean, the Biden team was right that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict should not be at the centerpiece of its U.S. policy, that the Secretary of State, as the saying goes, should not be the action officer for the Middle East peace process. But the question is, we need enough engagement in the region and the right kind of engagement to keep the situation under control, to manage what are very real interests for the United States, and again, not to necessarily solve all the problems, but at least to make sure that they don't start to threaten core U.S. national security interests. So what does that look like? Let's start by looking at what our interests actually are. And I would argue we have 3 central interests when it comes to the Middle East. The first is defending the U.S. homeland and American citizens and key allies from terror attacks. Now, some people will say, well, look, more people die falling in the shower than die from terrorist attacks, so maybe this isn't as important as it's made out to be. Look, that's true to some extent, but the reality is terror attacks have this disproportionate impact on American domestic politics, on our society as a whole, and how we respond. And so if we can invest properly in trying to avoid the worst of these, you're not going to avoid everything, but avoid, especially large-scale attacks against the U.S. and Europe and other key allies, it's going to make a huge difference. And I think that is something that we can do without expending too much capital. Second is stopping the spread of nuclear weapons in the region. And that starts with Iran, but it also is the potential responses from Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and other players. And here, I think the bottom line is the nuclear weapons are still the world's most dangerous weapons. And the Middle East is still one of the world's most unstable regions. And so that needs to remain a priority to keep these weapons out of this region. And the third core interest is preserving freedom of navigation in the region. And here, what I would say is, traditionally this has meant preserving oil supplies. I think that actually matters less, both because, U.S. Production has gone up in recent years. We're more independent. On top of that, the globe as a whole is diversifying away from oil and petrochemicals. And the reality is other countries like China in particular, and some countries in Asia and Europe are more dependent on Middle Eastern oil than US. And so even though it's an integrated market, and even though oil still matters, it doesn't matter as much. But what does matter, I think, a great deal is also preserving international trade. And here are the key choke points of the Suez Canal and the Bab el-Mandeb, which connect Asia and Europe, are absolutely critical. And so preserving freedom of navigation isn't just about oil. It really is just about trade and sea lanes. 2 other interests that I didn't really mention that I think just are less significant but are often justifications for American involvement in the Middle East. First is the focus on Israel's security. And obviously, Israel is a close partner of the United States that we care deeply about. But Israel is also much more powerful than it used to be. It has become a regional military and economic powerhouse. So frankly, it needs the U.S. less. I'm not sure this climbs up to these three levels of interest. The other is, great power competition with Russia and China in the Middle East. And here, this can't be a justification for endlessly dumping weapons or, investment into the region to compete with Russia and China. And some Russian and Chinese involvement is just fine. And I think what we need to do is just kind of look at the different things the Russians and Chinese are doing in the region and decide on a case-by-case basis where something is a problem for our interests and what kind of response is necessary versus one that isn't, as opposed to creating this broad umbrella in a region to invest heavily in the region, So those are U.S. interests. The next part of understanding a strategy has to do with what is actually happening in the region. So we can go to the next slide and talk a little bit about that. And this slide is very confusing, and that's on purpose because there's a lot of messy things happening in the region. But I would say, look, the region ultimately is characterized by unusual amounts of instability and conflict. And where does that instability and conflict come from? Well, it starts with the lack of political freedom and economic opportunity that exists in the region. According to Freedom House, this is the least free region in the world. And so what you've seen as a result of that is protest movements, right? You had obviously the so-called Arab Spring in 2011, or the Arab uprisings with Egypt, Syria, Tunisia, Libya, Yemen, Bahrain, protests elsewhere. But it's not as though those have gone away. We had a resurgence again of protests in 2019 in places like Algeria, Sudan, Lebanon, and Iraq, because again of poor governance at the ultimate and dissatisfaction from the population. So this problem sets ultimately a condition which then creates all the other challenges in the region. Now in some of these cases, as in Libya, Yemen, Syria, and Iraq, these challenges actually escalate into civil war. In the case of Iraq, it was actually an American intervention that started it. In Syria, Yemen, and Libya, it was the very forceful responses from different parts of the government in response to protests that started it. But the reality is, this instability is one of the things that creates opportunities for terrorist organizations to organize, for extremist groups to organize, and potentially threaten the United States. So there is this direct tie between lack of freedom and opportunity in the region and our interests, and our core interests. The second major factor in these conflicts and in the region overall is very intense state-on-state competition. And that's what you see with all these different lines from different countries intervening in each other's affairs. You basically have almost 4 different groupings in the Middle East at this point. You have Iran, you then have Saudi Arabia, UAE, and some of the other sort of conservative Arab states. You've got Turkey and Qatar, who are more open to working with Islamist groups. And you have Israel. And all these states are competing with each other in the region. And so whenever a place starts to get unstable, all of them are worried about losing influence and also see opportunities to compete with others. And so they all start dumping money and weapons into these different unstable places. And that turns these small civil wars into big, ugly civil wars. And there's a lot of history and research done on one of the biggest factors in terms of the ugliness and length of civil wars has to do with external intervention, and that as they increasingly become international proxy wars. And so this state-on-state competition then fuels these conflicts, which again creates this threat to the U.S. in terms of terrorism. It also, is a core explanation for why we're so worried about nuclear weapons in the region. Is all these states competing with each other in their security competition, which then leads to nuclear competition. So these two factors, right, lack of freedom and opportunity for the people of the region and intense state-on-state competition, are really at the center of all the things that challenge U.S. interests in the region. And yet our policy over the past 20 years has been to make all these things worse. Rather than address the poor governance problems and the lack of freedom, we pretty much enable authoritarian governance and invest heavily in relationships with these governments. We take sides in all these conflicts and interfere. Again, in Iraq, we started it ourselves. In Libya, we overthrew Gaddafi and then we kind of got out of the way. In Syria, we didn't intervene to get rid of Bashar al-Assad, but we did just enough to support the opposition to actually just prolong the conflict. We're just making these things worse in all these cases with our interventions. by trying to shape the outcome instead of just end these conflicts. And the other thing we do is just sell a lot of weapons into the region, which is not necessarily what you want to do if you're trying to reduce state-on-state competition. This is just going to make it worse. And so you put all those things together, and American policy, I believe, in the last 20 years has largely been working against like America's core interests. And so what do we do differently? So this is what we propose here at CNAS and what our program has been working on for, really the last year. A new U.S. strategy for the Middle East, which has 3 pieces to it. First, pursue a de-escalatory diplomatic strategy to end wars instead of winning them. The biggest threat to U.S. interests coming out of these civil wars is not that this leader wins or that leader wins or this group affiliated with that country wins. It's that the conflicts keep going and all the bad things that come out of the conflicts, especially terrorist attacks, mass migration flows, humanitarian catastrophes, are the biggest problems that we face coming out of these conflicts. And so our strategy needs to be first and foremost based on ending them, not ending them in a way that works best for our supposed interests, but actually just drags the conflict on. Second, pursue a people-first U.S. assistance and economic strategy. And we'll talk in more detail about this. We actually just released a paper today on precisely this topic with my colleagues, Kaylee Thomas, Daphne McCarty, and Sydney Scarlata, and that dives deeper into what a more sensible U.S. assistance and economic strategy should look like. But I should just say that, look, when the U.S. has been most effective in the world, we've led with diplomacy and we've led with our economic model and our governance model, and we've underwritten it with our security investments. And that's what we've done in places like Europe and Asia and the Indo-Pacific, where we've been successful. In the Middle East, we really just lead with the military, constantly using that tool, and we don't really move as far on these other tools of American national power that are frankly much more important, and much more effective, and where our real advantages lie. And so putting more of an emphasis on that. And third is reducing U.S. conventional military presence in the region. We need to get out of the addiction of throwing aircraft carriers into the Middle East and carrier strike groups. I mean, this has less to do with the region and more to do with our overall global posture and our focus on other challenges as well and maintaining the readiness of the force. But the bottom line is I believe we can still protect our bottom line interests in the region while reducing our force presence. Doesn't mean going to zero. It just means reducing, right? Again, we're not going to do the yo-yo diet. We're going to try to find that healthy, sustainable balance. So let's then dive deeper into these 3 different lines of effort. First, pursuing de-escalatory diplomacy. So what does that actually look like? I think right now it has to start with dealing with the challenges posed by Iran. The Biden administration is engaging right now in negotiations in Vienna with the other members of the P5+1 to return to the JCPOA with Iran. We'll see if that actually happens or not. The results have been somewhat mixed so far. Really the decision is in Iran's court at this point. And I think we'll know in the next few months how they plan to pursue. But the key is, and Jake Sullivan has described this as first you want to put the nuclear program back in the box. Because again, going back to our interests, it's probably the most critical. But then you really want to use it to build on that, to pursue broader de-escalatory diplomacy in the region. That means encouraging the Gulf states to engage with Iran, which has started happening now. Saudi Arabia is engaging in talks with Iran. The UAE is. And part of the reason that's happening is their own interests, but also it's mattered that the U.S. has been signaling them that this is something that we would like to see. And they pay attention to that because especially the Saudis have been nervous about their standing in Washington and in a new Democratic administration, and if they can demonstrate that they're a constructive player, like that will help them. There's a lot of opportunities for areas. We wrote a report about a year ago on like where you might take that regional dialogue. It could involve naval de-escalation. It could involve ways to reduce interference in each other's affairs. Iran stopped supporting actors inside Eastern Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia stopped supporting some actors inside of Iran. We can talk about COVID-19, the environment, which is a major issue in the Middle East with the challenges posed by global warming. And yes, it also means talking about issues like Yemen and Syria and ending some of these other regional conflicts with all these countries are involved. And so that's like, I think, one part of the escalatory diplomacy. A couple of other observations here. When it comes to wars like Syria and Yemen, I think, again, let's go back to the point of we need to end these conflicts first and foremost for the sake of the people there and for our own interest. And so we need to have realistic approaches. And I think the Biden administration is still reviewing its Syria policy. But for a long time, our Syria policy has been, we're going to use sanctions to get rid of Bashar al-Assad, and then we'll figure things out. So a guy who basically killed 500,000 of his own people in a brutal years-long civil war is suddenly going to give up because of sanctions and, with withholding of reconstruction aid. And until he does, we're not going to engage with him or his government in any way or do anything. To me, that doesn't make a lot of sense. I think we just need to figure out what a realistic outcome for Syria is that might involve him staying, at least for some period of time, as detestable and unpleasant as it is, and as much as the man belongs in The Hague on war crimes trials. Like, this is, I think, the world we're faced in. And I also think similarly in Yemen, we just need to take a very realistic approach about what is possible, given the fact that the Houthis control half of the country. Again, the objective needs to be, how do we most effectively end this war and the humanitarian crisis, not necessarily how do we, reshape things so that like all of Yemen can be reunited, because we'd like to see that, even though it seems very unlikely based on the situation on the ground. Finally, what does de-escalatory diplomacy mean? Just going back to the previous slide, when it comes to Israel-Palestine, I think there's no real prospect yet for a two-state solution, at least at the moment. But I think there's a lot of work that can be done on engaging behind the scenes, especially with the new Israeli government, to try and make slow progress to basically improve, prosperity, opportunities, security, and rights, basically for both Israelis and Palestinians. Improve the situation on the ground, work on rebuilding Gaza, work on looking for more sustainable political arrangements inside, to reunify Palestinians, and eventually move back towards two-state negotiations when an opportunity presents itself. But I think that's where the U.S. needs to go, and we outlined again that in a pretty comprehensive way in a report we put out back in December. So that's the escalatory diplomacy. On assistance and sort of rethinking U.S. assistance. So a few key observations from our report today, and you can go read the entire report online at People First U.S. U.S. assistance strategy for the Middle East. First of all, our assistance mix is completely off balance in the Middle East. We invest so heavily in security assistance, while economic governance and humanitarian gets so much less attention, even though in many ways it's more important. So our first recommendation is shift away from this heavy emphasis on military assistance, because at the end of the day, it's the underlying problems in the region are about opportunity and freedom for people, better governance and lack of corruption. And so another key recommendation is, a lot of times when we do economic assistance and governance assistance, it's first and foremost, and this is especially true in this region, about building a better relationship with the host country that's receiving the money, as opposed to actually focusing on outcomes. So if you want to build a better relationship with Egypt or Jordan by providing them with economic assistance to a monarchy and to a, basically a military-run authoritarian government, that's not going to get you, outcomes that you want, right? And so it's not as though the U.S. can do this by itself. This requires a regional approach. This requires the people of the region. It requires slow reforms in the form of the government. I think, as we've all learned, the U.S. can't do this militarily, but we need to be part of looking for a long-term approach here, instead of just kind of continuing to engage with the governments as they exist. And then just one other point here that I think is pretty essential. It doesn't mean security assistance goes away. But I think our security assistance really needs to be focused on training small elite forces that are good at doing counterterrorism, because that's what we need most. So groups like, the Iraqi counterterrorism forces, which were critical in countering ISIS, or the Lebanese Maghawir, or Emirati presidential guard. These small forces that can actually do on the ground countering irregular warfare operations. What we don't need to be doing is selling lots of big fancy airplanes and tanks into the region, which really just are sort of prestige investments, but don't actually, help our interests. And if anything, just increase the security dilemma in the region, and increase competition. So that's, I think, should be our focus in terms of secure assistance. Now, third, and this is the third part of the strategy, and the final part of the strategy, is reducing our military posture in the Middle East. So the next slide, please. And here, if we could just go to the next slide. So a few observations again, and we're going to have a report coming out on this in the months ahead. First, just a reminder, not every low-end threat requires an aircraft carrier or a B-52, okay? So we had last year Iranian sort of supported militia groups in Iraq launching rockets at U.S. forces on bases in Iraq. And our response was to put an aircraft carrier or carrier strike group into the region, or at least to publicize it as a way to deter, or fly B-52s and very loudly and proudly proclaim we were doing that. One, I don't think that these groups really care about that kind of message. Two, the costs are just way out of whack with what we're trying to, with the threat. And so, we really need to think more about like deterrence and what kind of deterrence actually works. The other thing we really need to rethink is, one of the major drivers of our posture in the Middle East is Iran and the possibility of contingency with Iran. And the way it goes is this, the thinking is, we need to be ready to destroy Iran's nuclear program. And I think that's true. We have to hold Iran's nuclear program like at threat and be ready to do that. However, what then happens is the argument then goes is if we attack Iran's nuclear program, they're going to respond with their proxies, with their missiles, in the naval arena. And so then we have to be prepared for all those things, and we have to absolutely get the region, postured in that way. And that to me doesn't make a lot of sense for two reasons. One is, look, it's not clear what the Iranian response will be. I mean, after the killing of Qasem Soleimani, which you can argue was probably even more provocative than just going after the nuclear program, the response was still somewhat, contained and restrained. And second, we have to be willing to accept some risk, right? That's, I think, the key to all this. So I would argue accept more risk, and be ready for multiple different kinds of responses. So look, I think in the region, ultimately what we need is the capacity to do counterterrorism, which means, special operations on the ground and some supporting ISR and air power, some deterrent against Iran, both in terms of naval capacity, to keep, freedom of navigation and to be able to hold the nuclear program at risk. And that's kind of enough. It's not zero, but it's significantly less than where we are now. So anyway, I will just close by saying that fundamentally what we need is an approach that, is more about diplomacy with modest objectives. It's about shifting engagement away from military and towards economic and governance assistance. And it's about more modest U.S. force and a willingness to accept some risk. And if we can do those things, we can have an entirely manageable strategy for the Middle East, which can allow us to finally have that healthy approach. And if we do, then we can focus on all the other things that we've spent this entire conference talking about that, frankly, in many ways are more important, but often get lost when we get distracted by this very challenging region. So with that, I'm going to close. And I think what we're going to see next is our next session, which is the Quad equation, how 4 democracies can uphold rules-based international order in the Indo-Pacific. And that's going to be moderated by Elissa Curtis, who's the director of our Indo-Pacific Security Program here at CNAS. This is not a live event, but something that was taped just earlier today because of different time zones. So I will defer to others as we transition off to that program. And thanks for joining me and spending time with us today.
Hello, I'm Elissa Curtis. I'm director of the Indo-Pacific Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. Welcome to our panel discussion on the Quad equation, how 4 democracies can uphold the rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific. The first ever Quad summit was held virtually in March, and we heard from White House Indo-Pacific Coordinator Kurt Campbell during his fireside chat with CNAS CEO Richard Fontaine on Tuesday that the Quad leaders will meet again, this time in person in the early fall. This is exciting news. Holding 2 leaders-level meetings within a 6-month period shows that the Quad is truly becoming the centerpiece of the Biden administration's Indo-Pacific strategy. So what can we expect from this emerging group of powerful democracies? Will they develop a coherent agenda and contribute to peace, stability, and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific? Well, here to discuss this topic, we have a truly highly distinguished panel. First, we have former Deputy Secretary of State Stephen Biegun. He was confirmed by the Senate for that position with a strong bipartisan vote of 90 votes to 3. And that's quite an accomplishment in this day and age. Secretary Biegun also served for 15 years as corporate vice president with the Ford Motor Company, as national security advisor to former Senate Majority Leader Bill Frist, and as deputy national security advisor to Condoleezza Rice. Next, we have Dr. Michael Fullilove, who is executive director of the Lowy Institute. Dr. Fullilove has worked as a lawyer and as a visiting fellow with the Brookings Institute. He is now, and he was previously also advisor to former Australian Prime Minister Paul Keating. In 2019, he was appointed a member of the Order of Australia for significant service in international relations. Next, we have former Indian Foreign Secretary Vijay Gokhale. He also served as ambassador to China and Germany. He is currently a distinguished professor at Symbiosis International and a non-resident senior fellow at Carnegie, India. He has published 2 books, Tiananmen Square and The Long Game. Last but certainly not least, we have Ambassador Shinsuke Sugiyama. He served with distinction as Japan's ambassador to the United States from March 2018 until January of this year. His diplomatic career spans over 40 years, including a stint as vice foreign minister. I met Ambassador Sugiyama at the White House in December 2020 on the very auspicious occasion in which he accepted the Legion of Merit Award on behalf of award recipient, former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. Ambassador Sugiyama also relayed a story to me that day about throwing the first pitch at a Nationals game in April 2019 and how he had practiced for weeks before doing so. I can only imagine the stress of throwing that pitch in front of thousands of Nats fans. So let's start our discussion. Secretary Biegun, I want to start with you. How did you see the Quad evolving during your time as Deputy Secretary of State? What were some of the pivotal moments, and what were some of the obstacles that you see in the Quad moving forward?
Well, thank you, Lisa, and hello to all of my fellow panelists. It's great to be here with you. The Quad was very much resurrected in the previous administration. Over the last 4 years, a Quad that was largely dormant was reestablished, energized, and formalized into a series of meetings at different levels that culminated in the previous administration with the December 2020 ministerial meeting in Tokyo, which was a very successful meeting and one that I think set the stage for enormous growth in the cooperation within the Quad among its partners in the years ahead. The challenges, of course, were many. There are still issues that I'm sure we'll discuss today upon which the members of the Quad don't entirely align. And those go to very important questions like regularizing, formalizing, and sizing the Quad as well. But also, one cannot rule out one can't ignore the very important influence of China in the development of the Quad as well. While China was not even a consideration in the start of the quadrilateral security dialogue in the early 2000s, it obviously has become an animating factor that affects all 4 of the Quad partners, and one that initially actually posed an obstacle. If you think back to 2007, 2008, when there were changes of government in both the United States and in Canberra, in Australia, there was a shift in government thinking that minimized the Quad and actually left it dormant for almost the full 8 years of the Obama administration. It was only resurrected in 2017 at the ASEAN summit among the leaders of the 4 countries, and that was a absolutely threshold moment, partially, I think, driven by shifting concerns in all four countries regarding the conduct of China in the Indo-Pacific.
Great, thank you. Let's turn to you, Dr. Fullilove. Secretary Biegun mentioned the change in government in 2007 in Australia, and we've seen some recent mudslinging in the Australian press about whether it was the Howard or Rudd government that tanked the Quad back in 2007. But how do you see Australia's approach to the Quad evolving over the past 15 years or so? What has marked some of the turning points for Australia in its attitude toward the Quad, in your opinion?
Well, thank you. And hello also to all my colleagues on the panel. And thank you, Lisa and CNAS and Richard Fontaine for inviting me to participate. Well, some of you have heard that Australian politics gets a little rough and tumble, and it has over the last 10 years in particular. And even something as sort of niche and esoteric as the quadrilateral security dialogue gets pulled into that. And you're right, Lisa, that there have been dueling op-eds between members of the Howard government and members of the Rudd government as to who was at fault. There's a lot of Jesuitical reasoning that goes into these op-eds. But, I think that I would say that the fact that both sides of politics are running away from the decision to allow the Quad to go dormant. The fact that both sides of politics and both leaders from that time are now embarrassed by that decision and they now regret it tells you something. As does the fact that in the aftermath of the first leaders meeting, you had former prime ministers and foreign ministers on both sides of politics claiming credit for the Quad. So I think that gives you an illustration of how quickly and wholly the Australian approach has changed. In 2007, 2008, both the Howard and Rudd government, it was a different era. We were in the lead up to the Beijing Olympics. We felt that we could make hay with China, even though it was run by a Marxist-Leninist party. We could do as much business as we wanted. There would never be consequences. And obviously thinking has changed, and the Australian relationship with China has changed very substantially since then. Now, analysts disagree about exactly why it's changed, but I would say that the main reason the Australia's relationship with China has changed is that China has changed. And it's a very different People's Republic that we're dealing with now, much more assertive, much more spiky, much more prickly, prone to, throwing all sorts of economic sanctions against a country that dares to call for a global independent international investigation into the origins of a pandemic that so far killed 10 million people. You might think that's a sort of a reasonable point to make, but in fact it's one that has put us well and truly in the freezer. So look, Australia I think had been moving in the direction for a number of years of thickening our connections with like-minded countries. Of course, we've always been very close with the United States, but doing much more with India, doing more with Japan. But really the worsening of relations between Australia and China in the past couple of years has been quite dramatic. And so it would be very strange if a country like Australia didn't grasp the Quad and see it for what it is, which is an opportunity to develop habits of cooperation with like-minded democracies that have clout. I think it's a real opportunity to build a sort of a positive agenda.
Well, thank you for that history. That's really quite interesting and some really great points made there. I want to come back a little bit later to the economic coercion piece that you mentioned. But first, I would like to turn to Ambassador Gokhale and ask you about India's attitude toward the Quad and how that has evolved over the years. I noticed a recent piece in the Indian press by Raja Mohan argued that India is shedding its anti-colonial, its non-alignment baggage and orienting itself more toward the West to cope with a more aggressive China, and as it seeks to decouple its economy from China's. And I wondered if you agreed with that assessment, and if you do you assess that India's shifting foreign policy orientation will lead it to give the Quad higher priority in its foreign relations? You're on mute, Ambassador Gokhale.
Thank you, Lisa. Let me pick up from where Secretary Biegun left off. I totally agree with him that Quad was significantly resuscitated as a result of the efforts of the Trump administration. And I would like to particularly emphasize 2 points in this regard. First, from India's perspective, we significantly enhanced relations in those years, not just with the United States, but also with Australia. Japan has been a much longer partner with us for the last 10 or 12 years, since Prime Minister Abe's first term in office. But it is the Trump administration and now the Biden administration and the current government in Australia which has been responsible for a closer relationship with which India feels more comfortable than it did earlier. So that was an important consideration. The second, as you hinted, was a change in the entire foreign policy orientation of the current government in India, Prime Minister Modi's government. Essentially, the maritime dimension has been added by him. And India now looks towards the ocean rather than towards the Himalayan frontiers as its principal area of foreign policy operations. That too brings us closer to a number of countries which have shared interests in the Indian Ocean. Australia, it goes without saying, has it, but also the United States and Japan. So I think these are solid underpinnings to Quad. And undoubtedly, the assertive policy of China has added to that, has given an added reason for 4 like-minded countries to come together. But I sometimes think that we should not overplay the China factor and ignore the other binding things that hold India, the United States, Japan, and Australia together. Because I believe that's where the foundations have to be laid. And in our perspective, at least, Quad goes well beyond any single country. And it's a concept which 4 of us share, which 4 of us have similar views on.
Great. Thank you. That's a wonderful point about it's not just an anti-China or countering China agenda. There's many other things that bind the 4 countries together and that they can work on. Ambassador Sugiyama, I think, we all have to thank former Prime Minister Abe for his initiative and foresight in understanding the important role that the Quad could play going back to 2007. He was the prime mover on this issue in these early days. He also coined the phrase Indo-Pacific in a speech that he gave in India in 2007. And frankly, since this is now the name of the program that I direct at CNAS, I feel like I have to personally thank former Prime Minister Abe. So are there particular issues that Japan would hope to see the Quad tackle? For instance, Japan has been at the forefront of recognizing the technology challenges that are posed by China, including with regard to 5G networks, as well as the protection of free and flow data across borders. We really have Japan to thank for raising some of these issues early on. So I would like to ask you, what are the most pressing technology issues that the Quad should address?
Well, thank you, Lisa. First of all, I very much would like to express my deep appreciation for how you introduced me, citing the moment when we all 3 ambassadors representing each of us 3, Australia, India, and Japan, including me, to be invited to White House to be given on behalf of our leaders by your former leader, by then National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien. And then that was really something that I immediately report things back to then former Prime Minister. And then immediately after I came back from Washington, after I finished my formal duty as a Japan's envoy to the States, I was able to see then former Prime Minister Abe, and then he was kind enough to invite me for dinner, and then he was really, really appreciative of your government and your people, praising his efforts and praising the Australian leaders and then Indian leader to join him and join us. He actually showed me the medal in his office, pointing out that that's one of his most privileged medals which he received over the entire political life in the leadership. That said, first let me get back to your question directly. I think these points about technologies and then sensitive technologies like 5Gs or 6Gs or faraway or space or whatever is one of the things which we all faced with jointly. By the way, before getting into further, I think my former Prime Minister's main focal point is free and open Indo-Pacific region. So by definition, it is not necessarily try to be gang up against one country or trying to contain one country or anything, but try to make it certain that the region is being based upon free navigation and then more connectivity activities freely, and then based upon rules of laws. That's a fundamental sort of an idea which my former Prime Minister tried to raise. So based upon that, I think these particular issues like Fairways or 5Gs or sensitive technology, including semiconductors, networking and supply chains and those sort of things consist of one of the major areas, but not only one area that we have to address upon. But I think by doing that, not alone, each one of us, but by us kind of, if not collectively, but trying to doing in a friendly manner, jointly, and in a cooperative manner, I think the end result is showing is much better. Take an example of something about Faraway thing. I think it was 2 years ago or 2.5 years ago or something, immediately after I started doing that, my job as an envoy representing Japan to the States. Many people from Japan and from United States and others very much worried that if it were going as such, in 2 years' time from there on, the Faraway and Chinese technology is going to be dominant. Not only us, but also Europe and Asia, Africa, Latin America, and everywhere. But after 3 years or so, or 2 years or so from there on, things become seem to be slightly better. That because of our cooperation, Japan, US, and Australia, being joined by India from time to time, we seem to be, if not trying to beat their certain superiority in the technology stance, but at least we can become competitive against their dominance. I think I'm not trying to deny altogether the Chinese importance of trying to develop their own, technologies. As long as they are doing that in a rule-based way, as long as they are being engaged in an international society, as we are doing. But if they are not, we have to be competitive, try to be against, they are trying to be dominant in the world of affairs, in that important field of the sensitive technologies and that sort. And I think by doing that, not necessarily only the Quad system, Quad cooperation, but like this, I think we seem to be doing much, much better off. And then Quad is one of the best examples to show that good end result so far. But we are still in the midst of doing that. We are not completed everything. So what I try to be emphasizing upon is that let's move forward like we have done, as we are doing, and then as we will doing. That's my part of my answers. Thank you.
Great. Very, very well put. And I do want to give the opportunity, of course, other panelists are welcome to join in if they have any other things to add. But in particular on this technology issue, I just want to give the opportunity. Does anybody want to jump in here? Okay. But again, like I said, feel free to jump in if you have any other comments on the technology issue or any other issue that we're discussing. So let me turn to you again, Secretary Biegun. You held a series of meetings with the Quad countries plus South Korea, Vietnam, and New Zealand in the months initially following the outbreak of the global pandemic. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about what you think these meetings accomplished. And do you think that this way that you held these meetings could serve as a basis for future Quad Plus initiatives? How should the Quad think about engaging other like-minded countries on issues that may, stretch beyond the Quad? I wondered if you could comment on that.
Well, thank you, Lisa, and I will comment on that. But let me just make a comment too on Ambassador Sugiyama's, I think, a very, very pointed and appropriate remarks. The success of the Quad will come from its ability to define itself for what it's in support of rather than what it's against. And I think this has been one of the greatest branding exercises of the 21st century, was to establish the rubric of the Quad would move in support of a free and open Indo-Pacific. And the fact that elicits opposition or concern in some quarters is all the more suggestive of not only its appropriateness, but its purpose. The Quad has a number of positive and proactive areas where the members can work together. Technology has been cited, but pandemic relief and reaction to COVID is obviously one as well. And I was really quite pleased that this was one of the centerpieces of the leader level meeting, the virtual leader level meeting that happened, which illustrates the value of the Quad, not only to the region, but to each other. And also it underscores the positive and constructive nature of this group of like-minded democracies in their pursuit of a common agenda in support of a free and open Indo-Pacific. So to your specific question about the series of coordinating calls that we launched in, I guess it was February of 2020, I have to first concede that it was born of necessity. When the pandemic began to descend upon all of us, but in particular, hitting some of our partners in the Indo-Pacific early on, Japan and South Korea, later spreading even more aggressively here to the United States of America, and tragically to India most recently, we were not only compelled as partners and friends to find methods of cooperation, we had to defend ourselves, not only against the spread of a terrible virus, but also recall a particularly aggressive disinformation campaign commenced in February and March and April of 2020 that was remarkable in its intensity and ferocity, and was directed very much at some of the countries in the Quad, as well as some of our European partners. The pandemic spread so quickly that all of our countries were caught with citizens, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of citizens marooned in every corner of the world on cruise ships, on holidays, on business travel, or just citizens who had expatriated who wanted to urgently return home as an instinctive reaction to such a calamity as a global pandemic. And it was impossible to do this without international coordination. And so the other necessity, of course, that drove this was we were unable to meet in person. I traveled for the first time in 2020. I traveled to Japan and South Korea in late summer, and I was the first visitor, first senior level governmental official in either South Korea or Japan in a 6-month period. That means that my counterparts, the state secretaries or deputy foreign ministers, as well as the ministers, were not meeting with counterparts in person for an entire 6-month period, which is just astonishing. But what we were able to do is sustain on a weekly basis a coordinating call between the countries you mentioned. It was the Quad countries, but we also included New Zealand and Vietnam and South Korea. Now, it was not organized around the concept of the Quad per se. It was organized around the concept of like-minded countries who would cooperate with each other in order to address and coordinate response to the pandemic. And it was extremely successful in doing that. We repatriated our citizens together. We developed patterns of cooperation on sharing desperately needed personal protective equipment at that time. We updated each other on best practices on how to contain the virus. I still remember my calls, the advice from our South Korean counterparts who were so generous with sharing accurate information and data about the spread of the virus, and was the first data we had to go on that we could rely upon because the Chinese had simply refused to share sound information with us early on in the virus's spread. South Korea was ravaged by the virus, but they also accumulated an enormous amount of experience in how to respond to it. All of that was shared with this coalition of Indo-Pacific countries. You know, I am loath to ever acknowledge any silver lining from this terrible pandemic, and the cost to all of our nations has been unacceptably high. But we were able to do something in those weeks. This played out over many, many weeks. A regular call, Thursday evenings here in the U.S. I would sign on at 9:30 or 10 p.m. We would go for about 45 minutes, and each of my counterparts at the deputy foreign minister level would give an update and where they needed help. That we were able to sustain this was because of the pandemic, because there was no other option, and it was a necessity. So I think that, to take it back to a larger theme, I think that illustrates exactly what we can do in the Quad. It wasn't about an alliance. It wasn't about military activities. It was about like-minded countries responding to the imperative to help each other at a critical moment. And it still remains one of the most satisfying parts of my tenure as deputy.
Well, thank you for that. That was really interesting and just a great example of very tangible, concrete cooperation that can happen among the Quad, but also other countries as well. And let me take this opportunity to thank you, Secretary Biegun, for your service. I think the American people were lucky to have somebody like you in such a senior position at the time of crisis. So thank you for that. Dr. Folov, I'd like to turn to you and come back to an issue that you raised briefly in your opening remarks about the economic coercion that Australia has faced in the form of China cutting beef and barley imports after Australia called for an investigation into the origins of the coronavirus. And of course, more recently, President Biden has asked the U.S. intelligence agencies to redouble their efforts to look into this question of the origins of the coronavirus. But how, in your view, might the Quad deal with the issue of Chinese economic coercion? Are there specific policies or actions that the Quad could take to strengthen resilience among the Indo-Pacific nations and make them less susceptible to Chinese economic coercion? Some of the things that have been recommended are maybe a pact among the Quad countries that if they are targeted for Chinese economic coercion, they would either issue a joint statement of condemnation, or they would organize assistance that would be provided to the targeted nation. In your opinion, is there anything that the Quad can collectively do to deter or react to Chinese economic coercion?
Well, thank you very much. Look, I'm not sure that, even though Australia is a subject of attempted economic coercion at the moment, I'm not sure actually that the Quad is the right vehicle I mean, great powers nation states are cold monsters, and the Quad countries have different trade interests from each other. I think probably reforms to the WTO are more likely to be effective than specific policy items at the Quad level. I'm attracted to the idea that Steve and others have said on the call, that we have to look at a positive agenda for the Quad that is not just about China, but it's about positive things we can do with each other. And also, as I mentioned before, that developing habits of positive cooperation, making sure that the leaders meet regularly, making sure that they are quick to pick up the phone to each other. So to me, I'm not quite sure that the Quad has developed to the point where it's the obvious vehicle to deal with what is going to be an increasing problem. Having said that, I think where it is good is in expanding our worldview and in lifting the eyes of the Quad countries and others above the parapet. Solidarity matters. And even if it's solidarity in the form of a statement, that kind of thing helps. So, for example, the comments that Secretary Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan made at Anchorage in their meeting with their Chinese counterparts, that attempts by the United States to coerce an ally like Australia would actually make it difficult for the US-China relationship to improve. I think that sort of statement is useful. So I think statements of solidarity are helping. I think it's all part, as Vijay was talking about, it's all part of us seeing how we can thicken our connections with each other. How can we expand our minds? I think for a long time, a lot of us put all our eggs in one basket. And there were good economic, mathematical reasons to do that. But there's a risk there. And we've all seen the risk, and Australia is feeling the effects of the risk. And so where I would like to see, where I think the Quad can help with these kind of issues is solidarity, but also diversifying our thinking, diversifying the markets we aim for, diversifying the leaders that we pick up the phone to discuss with, creating a shared strategic communities among the countries, encouraging more exchange of information. I think these are ways of building resilience which are appropriate for the Quad at this particular moment in its development.
Great, thank you. Very, very good points about thickening the relationships among each other, and then statements of solidarity when this coercion is practiced. All very good advice. So Ambassador Gokhale, I'd like to ask you about India has been extremely cautious when the issue of joint military exercises among the Quad countries is raised, or in fact, any kind of defense cooperation among the four nations. Now, some observers assess that Chinese border aggression against China in the spring and summer of 2020 actually prompted India to finally invite Australia to participate in the fall 2020 Malabar exercise. I wondered if you agreed with that assessment, or if you think there are additional factors or circumstances in which India might become more open to Quad military coordination, or even, maritime security type of cooperation or coordination.
Lisa, I would only partly agree with that, because I think that the most important change taking place in India is a mindset change. And therefore, if you look at what has happened in the previous 4 to 5 years, you will find a string of, for example, logistics agreements that we have concluded not only with the United States, where we have done 3 of them, 3 important ones, but with Australia and Japan as well. The cross-servicing agreement with Japan and the mutual legal logistics agreement with Australia. I think that's indicative of a changing mindset, of shedding historical baggage, you might say. Now, I think what Michael said is important, which is trying to evolve something common that we stand for. And I think collaboration in the security field will get strengthened quite a bit. If, for instance, we act together in defining what a rules-based order should be in the Indo-Pacific. Frankly speaking, we all talk about it, but there is no rules-based order in a classical sense. The ASEAN Regional Forum and the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting plus are platforms. But beyond that, there's no consensus of what sort of a security mechanism or security system or security rules should be there. And I think the timing is right because China has made it very clear that it's going to expand its navy to the point where it will have a semi-permanent or permanent presence in the Indian Ocean. The United States is present there. Australia and India are certainly also ramping up their naval presence. So I think 4 countries with similar values and similar commitments trying to define a rules-based order is one way we can sort of persuade India to shed any remaining inhibitions it has. Another way, of course, as Michael said, was trying to see how we can offer an economic alternative. Now, that's easier said than done because the United States has a different system of helping countries. India has its own system. Japan and Australia, which have done it for much longer than India in Southeast Asia and elsewhere, have their own systems. But I think this is where a bit of consultation can synergize in a way in which we don't really have to dovetail all our rules and regulations. That's going to be well nigh impossible. But at least come together in doing different parts of projects so that we pool together our resources and see that we deliver on a project, which otherwise individually, besides the United States, none of the others may be able to do. So I'd say that this is important. Now, of course, I don't deny that what happened in 2020 on the northern boundary with India, and the situation still persists until now, has had an impact. Because it has, in a sense, sort of finally woken up the Indian public from the sort of rather naive assumption that what we decided in 1988 as being the modus vivendi between India and China would sort of carry on indefinitely. And therefore, there is a realization that a new modus vivendi is needed. We are dealing with a very different China from the one we dealt with in the 1990s or the early 2000s, and that we need partners to strengthen our own hands as well. So there's no doubt that that has played an important role. But I think much bigger is our perception, the perception in India that if our maritime foreign policy is to take off, we need to have a new rules-based order in that region. And that certainly India wants to work with Australia, Japan, the United States, and other like-minded partners. There are others, France, for instance, Indonesia, for instance. And together we can do better than by ourselves. I put it that way, Lisa.
Great, thank you. No, interesting contrast that you made between the economic coordination and how it would be difficult to align all the rules and regulations among the 4 countries when it comes to the economic situation, as contrasted with the maritime challenges and how there is a need to come up with sort of a code of conduct to address some of China's naval aggression in different parts, the South and East China Sea. So I think that's an interesting contrast that you made. Ambassador Sugiyama, I'd like to turn to you. And, it was significant that Taiwan was mentioned in the Suga-Biden joint statement following their meeting in April. So I would like to ask you, should the Quad take up the issue of Taiwan? Should there be any kind of public statements, or should the issue be dealt with quietly behind closed doors? But given there's increasing concern about China's provocative moves in the Taiwan Strait, Is it time for the Quad to deal with this issue, or would that only complicate matters? Ambassador Sugiyama, can you?
The answer is yes and no. First of all, I need at least to get back to full. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. We can hear you.
Hello.
We can hear you.
Yeah. Okay. Can you hear me? Yes. To get back. May I just speak up?
We can hear you, Ambassador Sugiyama.
I try to get. I need at least 60 minutes or something. Yes, in the sense that it's natural. Can you? Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear.
Hello?
We can hear you just fine, Ambassador Sugiyama. Can you hear us?
Hello.
Okay.
Yes, I can. All right. May I just get back to your question?
Yes.
Hello. Hello. Yeah, can I get back?
Yes, we can hear you, Ambassador Sugiyama. We'll try one more time. Please go ahead. Okay, I think we may have some technical difficulties, so I think we're going to need to move on. Hopefully, Ambassador Sugiyama will be able to join us a little bit later. I would like to now go to some of the audience questions. We actually reached out yesterday to solicit these questions and wanted to give the audience who will be viewing the program a little bit later a chance to chime in. So let's first take a question from Lauren and Sam. They ask, do you see merit in expanding the Quad to include other major Indo-Pacific partners, or to develop side working groups with countries like South Korea or the nations of ASEAN? And the second part of the question is, if the Quad became a Quint, which country would you vote into the Quad? So is there anybody interested in taking this question? I know Secretary Biegun talked a little bit about the Quad Plus meetings that took place after the outbreak of COVID. Does anybody want to expand on this issue of bringing additional members in, or how does the Quad engage with other countries?
Lisa, let me just expand a little bit on this, because we have some experience with this from our efforts earlier in the year, early in 2020, when we put together this coordinating group of Pacific countries. The challenge is, where do you stop? Who do you not invite, and how do you avoid a negative effect of appearing to create something that's exclusive and by nature excludes other countries? What we were successful in doing with COVID-19 was aided by where the virus was actually impacting parts of Asia. Vietnam had the chairmanship of ASEAN at the time, so could be representative of ASEAN, and so we were able to very quickly assemble a logical set of countries to cooperate on COVID-19. But if it was a different issue, it might have been a different set of countries. And I can think of any number of circumstances where important voices like Bangladesh or Indonesia would play a very important role in the deliberations of like-minded countries cooperating on imperatives for all of our countries in the Indo-Pacific. These type of groupings, this kind of dynamic engagement across the region is, I think, the best way to size the Quad. We have 4 countries at the core of this who've developed a pattern of cooperation, but in different combinations that can be built out. That also has the political benefit of allowing us to avoid the perception of exclusivity, and also of not forcing countries uncomfortably into partnerships in a manner that might be politically challenging for them. I think all of us, I don't care to enumerate them, but we can all imagine what kind of groupings might be more challenging than others, but that won't exclude countries from working together. And so this very concept was discussed in Tokyo among the ministers in December of last year, that different sets of Quad members even would work with different sets of other countries in the Indo-Pacific on areas of mutual interest. And so for now, I think that's the best way to work through the issue of sizing the Quad, rather than try to formalize it and then add members through some criteria. I think that would be counterproductive, and quite frankly, I think it would fail.
Great, thank you. I want to come to Dr. Fullilove on this. I know you have some comments here, but first I see Ambassador Sugiyama has joined us. So Ambassador Sugiyama, welcome back, and getting back to this question of how the Quad should deal with the Taiwan issue, if it should at all. Okay, I think he must still be having difficulty. Apologies for that. So Dr. Fullilove, let's go back to you, and if you could comment on this issue of an expanded Quad.
We can see the Quad has some work to do on critical technology challenges in Tokyo, apart from anything else. Look, I really am attracted to the way Steve Biegun addressed this question of expanding the Quad. I actually, on my podcast, The Director's Chair, I had Admiral Harry Harris last week, and I asked Harry about this, and he had a funny line. He said, the Quad reminds me of a lot of American football college conferences. We have the Big 12 with 10 members and the Big 10 with 14 members. So you don't theoretically have to stick with 4 just because the word Quad sounds good. But the reason I like sticking to the core is this tension in multilateral organizations between representativeness and effectiveness. And the more representative an organization becomes, the less effective it usually becomes. And you can think of the General Assembly, perhaps you can think of meetings of the North Atlantic Council and so on. What I like about the Quad is it's small, as opposed to other organizations like ASEAN and APEC. It's like-minded, and the worldviews are similar to some extent between the 4 Quad countries. And finally, you have four Quad countries with clout. Each of us have in our own way the ability to get the mail through to different extents. The United States, the most powerful country in the world, the top dog, the leading global power, the most powerful military in the world, the largest economy. India, a country of nearly 1.4 billion people that, as Vijay said, is changing its worldview. Japan, I think, is the 3rd largest economy, world technology leader, highly effective self-defense force. Australia is a significant player in its own way, and one that has a long history of providing global security goods. So I think the more that you attract, the more that you buckle or you kind of attach other countries that are not outward looking, that are very focused on the waters or the borders around their own country, or the more that you try to loop in European partners, for example, you hear that from time to time, that they should join the Quad. I think some people got Quad envy after President Biden made the Quad leaders meeting the first multilateral meeting he hoped. But I think we should take it easy, and I think Steve's approach is better. That is, you work with what you have, and you be pragmatic about that, and you develop it slowly with a positive agenda. I think it's important to put strategic muscle and policy muscle on the skeleton, and think of positive ways that we can work together. And then, as Steve says, come up with minilateral arrangements where different groupings of Quad countries work with other like-minded countries that have some effectiveness in cloud as well. I think that's the best approach.
Great, thank you. So we have another question, and this is, many of us know him, Mark Mannion of Congressional Research Services. And I actually first met Mark on my first trip to Japan in 2007. So it's great to hear from him. And his question is directed specifically at Secretary Biegun. He asks, could you talk about the challenges and process of negotiating whether to put out a multilateral joint statement and the negotiating that went into that? Did the Trump administration ask the other 3 Quad countries to release a joint statement at the 2020 Quad foreign ministers meeting? If not, why not? And if so, what prevented it from happening? Secretary Biegun?
Well, thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Mark, for the question. When the history is written, perhaps sometime decades from now, about the development of the Quad and its patterns of cooperation, its positive agenda, and issues like regularizing, formalizing, sizing, and the mission or the purpose of the grouping. I think the December 2020 ministerial meeting that happened in Tokyo will rate as one of the watershed moments. Secretary Pompeo, there with his Japanese, Australian, and Indian counterparts, still in the midst of a very severe pandemic, I might add, so at some risk to themselves and at some discomfort for themselves, because not only did they have to abide by very strict social distancing and masking requirements, but some of the secretary's counterparts were required to even quarantine upon returning home for an uncomfortable period of time. But all felt that it was important to, at that moment, take the next step in how we were going to proceed in cooperation in the Quad. That meeting, which I was not at, incidentally, so I'm speaking as a third party here. That meeting did produce a robust set of agreements and cooperative ambitions among the 4 parties, and a decision was made to keep that among the parties. But I think you're already seeing it come to life. Among the things that were agreed were to elevate the meetings of the Quad, regularize the meetings at the leader level, in addition to the ministerial level. And we now have, with the enthusiastic embrace by the Biden administration of what was developed over those 4 years, we see that coming to life. And I give full credit to President Biden for his early action on this, and also for his strong commitment to continue this as in person. The reason it wasn't released is in part because of some of the sensitivities that we've talked about today. There isn't complete alignment among the Quad members on formalizing. There isn't a single point of view on what the size or membership or participants of the Quad should be. But those are also issues that there's no compelling reason to address. There's something to be said for allowing an organization like this to develop organically. And the regularizing part of it was a very important part. And because that is the fertile soil in which this organic process will continue. And we don't know what the full limits of cooperation will be among the Quad members, and to state it in a published joint statement early on, I could be more limiting, I think, than empowering. So I actually not sure that we should want the Quad to simply meet as every other international or multilateral organization does and produce these tortured statements at the end, leader statements that oftentimes read more like laundry lists. I think there was a very strong common view of the importance of the Quad. There was a very strong common view of the need to regularize the meetings of the Quad, and there was a mutually agreeable sense of flexibility to allow that process to proceed organically, and it should. You know, the Quad is not a military alliance. It will likely never take on that form. Certainly, it's not an antecedent to developing stationed forces in each other's countries or anything along the lines of what we saw in the Cold War alliances. But we're all watching with concern developments in China, and how China develops will very much have an impact upon the organic development of the Quad as well, and where its areas of priority are. So I like where we are. I don't think there's a necessity for published statements, and the agreements we reached in Tokyo, that the four governments reached in Tokyo, seem to me to be moving along very well, even with the transition of government, which, remember, in 2007, 2008, in a few of our countries actually led to a paralysis in the Quad. Here, we see a smooth transition to a new prime minister in Japan, to a new president in the United States, and I'm confident that the same will happen regardless of the electoral outcomes in Australia and India.
Thank you. We have a couple minutes.
So I'm sorry, because of the malfunctioning of Japanese technology, I missed some part of it. But may I get back to you about your question about Taiwan and something related to that?
Yes, please.
You see, yeah, but I try to be as short as possible. Of course, if you try to take a look at the map of Indo-Pacific region, Taiwan is a part of it. And then because of what is going on Xinjiang, Uyghur, and Tibet, and even in Hong Kong, Taiwan question is even more important than ever because it might relate to our territory of Senkaku Islands. The fact shows that they are invading more than 130 or 40 days, continuously, which is really, really something. But at the same time, Taiwan is really, really important part of this region, but it's not the only part. We do have to see Andaman, Nicobar, Chittagong, Trincomalee, and then Guadal, Salalah, Aden, Djibouti, Mombasa. Taiwan is a part of these sort of thing. Of course, it's one of the most important parts, but this is not the only single important part of the entire region. That's my answer.
Thank you. It's great to have you back in the conversation. I know we're running out of time. We only have a few minutes left. There was a final question, and I think it's a good one to end on. And if everybody could chime in with brief answers, that would be great. And the question is, without hard power backing the soft power issues, is that unlikely to matter much in the competition with China? So I'd like to ask each of you, and I'll start with Ambassador Gokhale, if you want to comment on this issue, or if there's another final word you'd like to say on the topic. Ambassador Gokhale?
I'll comment on this issue, Lisa. I think, as Michael said, each country also has its own capabilities in terms of military and other hard power. That doesn't mean that we have to come together in any sort of a formal way. But I think when we come together as a group, there is the unstated objective that should it be required. There is a much greater capacity for the four countries to come together. So my sense is that the formation of the Quad is not, as the other speaker said, directed against anybody. We should actually form an organization which stands for something and not against something, as Secretary Biegun said. But that doesn't mean that we don't have the wherewithal to stand against something if that threatens the values and interests that all four of us share.
Very well put. Thank you so much. Dr. Fullilove, would you like to give a final comment?
Well, we've also had a critical technology challenge here in Sydney. As you can see, all the lights have gone off. So I'm sorry to appear like the Emperor in Star Wars. It's almost like there are gremlins in the machine, isn't it, Lisa?
The
Look,
most important thing is we can still hear you.
no, look, I'd agree exactly with BJ. He put it very elegantly. None of us are without capabilities, military capabilities, but that's not the only thing that changes the world, actually. Mindsets change the world, and worldviews. When worldviews change, the world changes. And all of us want to make our way in the world. None of us want to live in the shadow of another large state. We all want to have our sovereignty, our right to make our own way, make our own decisions, and to live in a world in which states are able to make their own decisions. And that's where we can work with friends in the Quad countries to sort of expand our mindset, to realize there are different opportunities, there are diverse opportunities out there, and we can stand in solidarity also with each other. So no, I don't accept that, unless it's an Asian NATO, it's irrelevant. This is not going to be an Asian NATO. It's not going to be a military alliance, but it can expand mindsets in Australia and the United States and India and Japan, and we're seeing other countries see that. They see the power of the example, and I think the power of the example can be very powerful.
Thank you. Extremely thoughtful response. Ambassador Sugiyama, any final thoughts?
Yes. I think my final statement is this. As I told you before, this originated from the idea of free and open Indo-Pacific region. That is naturally meaning that this notion is not exclusive, but inclusive. This is not something to exclude anybody, but to not formalize anything. So this is free and open Indo-Pacific region. And this is something which Prime Minister Abe said to Modi at the outset. I remember vividly when Prime Minister Modi and then my former Prime Minister Abe talked with each other, showing the maps between the twos on this region, which includes Taiwan, but as I said, all the other certain places. So this is, I try to be with Indian friend as well as Australian friend and then Steve, that this is not something we try to formalize. We try to fix things. We try to make any sort of, standing committee, whatever. But this is some kind of, loose coordination, policy coordination process, which might expand some of the others to come in, which might not. We'll see. But let's try to move forward based upon free and open Indo-Pacific region by us four.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Sugiyama. Secretary Biegun, you have the last word.
I just want to thank you very much for an excellent panel and commend CNAS for developing a program directly focused on the Indo-Pacific and on issues like this. The intensity of coverage matches the conviction in the four governments, and I know that that conviction is going to be sustained. There's a sense of opportunity and excitement at the ability of our countries to really align around these issues at this point. There's a lot of work to do. We should try to avoid burying the efforts in ambition, allowed to grow organically. And I think there's a very bright future for free and open Indo-Pacific. With these four countries cooperating, I think anything is possible.
Thank you so much. And I want to give a hearty thanks to all of you. This has really been the most illuminating and thoughtful panel on the Quad that I've heard ever. And thank you all for your quality remarks and contributions. And I also want to thank the audience for staying with us and for joining this conversation. And this does complete the third day of CNAS's annual conference. We'll be regathering to continue the conference next Tuesday, June 15th. And at that time, we'll feature the Pitch 2021, a competition of new ideas. That's at 11 a.m. Eastern time. So I hope you will join us then. And if you have any questions about the schedule, just visit conference.cnas.org for more information. I hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.